Okay then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 172. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And of course, 172 is not a prime number. It is in fact 2 times 2 times 43. And we got kind of a long list of questions today, so I shouldn't really take up too much time with a lengthy preamble. Just introduce you to the beverage. So I got that. I've also prepared, I've got the bobblehead heretic Mahayana monk. And so, got the emergency backup little paper umbrella with no emergency backup beverage. So I'm kind of taking a risk by not having the emergency backup beverage, but we'll just see how it goes. And I suppose I should just wade into this, just start answering questions relentlessly, like some sort of question terminator. And the first question is from Romeo. And I'm always resisting the urge for the wherefore art thou Romeo stuff. So I'm just, don't even wait for it because it's not going to happen. Romeo says, although I was raised Catholic, I have long since left Christianity behind. Every now and then, my interest in Buddhism comes up in conversation with people in my life who remain devout Christians. This sometimes leads to some awkward moments. The reaction I usually get from them is a mix of concern, confusion, fear, and a bit of disdain. Let's see here. Recently, one particularly zealous family member even gave me a warning that my going too deeply into Buddhism would open me up to evil spirits and demons. A few Google searches later, and I came to find that this aversive view of Buddhism is not limited to people in my life. I even came across an article from a Christian preacher that warns against something as innocuous and beneficial as mindfulness meditation of all things. Have you ever come across this paranoiac view of Buddhism from followers of other religions, either online or in your everyday life? If so, how do you respond to them? How do you make sense of such warped views of Buddhism? So, probably the most extreme reaction from a Christian, from a non-Buddhist that I got ever was, I used to do a lot of commenting in the Breitbart comment sections, and my name in the Breitbart comment sections is politically incorrect Buddhist. So Buddhist is in my name, and as you may imagine, Breitbart gets a lot of conservative, sort of blue collar type Christian people, not highly intellectual. It's like the IQ level of Breitbart comments is somewhat lower than the IQ level of X. That's just the way it works out. You don't really go to Breitbart comments for the purpose of having a stimulating conversation. It can happen, but your odds are better on other platforms. So anyways, somebody just saw my name, politically incorrect Buddhist, in the comments, and this person was, they were saying that mantras, when you meditate using a mantra, that really you're calling out the names of demons so that they can possess you more easily. And also they were saying that the weird contortions of the body, confusing Buddhism with hatha yoga, is making it easier for the demons to get in, which is pretty extreme. And some hysterically intolerant preacher probably told them this stuff, and they just believe it. That would be the most extreme example of what Romeo is talking about. I remember one time, a supervisor at work, who's a really nice guy, just the blue collar, just probably goes to church. Maybe he goes to church, I don't know, but he's a Christian. And he asked about my YouTube channel or something, and I said, it's I answer questions about Buddhist philosophy, and he asked me, are you a Buddhist? And I said, more Buddhist than anything else. And then he just kind of made this sound like, pfft. maybe it wasn't as extreme as that. I mean, he didn't jerk the head sideways or anything, but it was just sort of like this kind of a sound that indicated that he was not exactly satisfied with my answer. And of course, when I was a junior monk, before I even went to Burma, still in California, there was this really nice Jehovah's Witness guy who would come like once a week trying to convert me. And I remember one time, I mean, he was giving me lots of these Jehovah's Witness pamphlets, you know, like Watchtower magazine and all this stuff. So finally one time I tried to give him, it was like a little booklet, like a Goenka booklet. You know, I just, you know, sort of turnabout is fair play and all that. So I tried to offer him this, and he didn't do it really consciously, but he recoiled from that Goenka pamphlet as though I were trying to hand him like a centipede or something. You know, it was like real, just genuine, like deep aversion, like, whoa. You know, he just backed up, you know. He didn't want to even touch it. But let's see here. Let's just get to the actual question. Let's see. Have you ever come across this paranoid view of Buddhism from followers of other religions, either online or in your everyday life? Yeah, well, I've answered that part. If so, how do you respond to them? Well, I mean, just not responding is probably best. And I mean, they're not like right in my face. It's not like any kind of confrontational thing. You know, like some ignorant person in Breitbart comments, I might like calmly explain the truth of the situation. I mean, that's probably best. You know, just calmly, more or less rationally explain to them, you know, how they are mistaken in their assumptions. With regard to the supervisor at work, I mean, he just kind of made this sound, and I just, you know, just didn't really follow up on that. So let's see. How do I respond to them? I answered that part. And so how do you make sense of such warped views of Buddhism? Well, I mean, it is strange because, like, for example, especially in like the contemplative orders of Christianity, like, you know, Carmelite Christians, Carmelite Catholics, I should say, or, you know, some of the Greek Orthodox or just Russian Orthodox sects, you know, they have yogic practice, not just asceticism and prayer, but also they've got mindfulness practice. They call recollection. At least St. John of the Cross called what a Buddhist calls mindfulness recollection, which is kind of weird because recollection means memory, and the Pali word sati in like ordinary parlance in the northern Ganges or northern India, Ganges Valley in the Buddhist time, I mean, it also mainly means memory. So why, like, completely, like, dismissing memory and being in the present moment came to be called recollection for the Catholics, and, you know, like, mindfulness, which, like, recollection in ancient India also is something that I really do not understand. And I don't know if there's any connection, or it was just some weird coincidence where essentially just, like, abolishing the memory and just being in the present moment gets used. I mean, the word for it is a word that means memory. That part I don't understand. But like the practices in Buddhism, practices like in the Discalced Carmelites, of whom St. John of the Cross was an ordained member, is very similar. The main differences are just the theory. You know, it's just the narrative and that kind of thing. But the actual practice is remarkably similar. And some of the insights that arise from that practice that aren't like attached to some dogma and like, you know, like conforming to some dogma, those also are remarkably similar. Like some of the insights of St. John of the Cross are very similar to what you can find in the suttas. So, I mean, there is that similarity, and it's mainly just the theory part. You know, it's like the view part that is like the stumbling block, in my opinion. Especially for Christians, it seems. Let's see, there was something else I was going to say. Oh yeah, with regard to like Catholics, I mean, one thing you can say to like a Christian, especially if they're a Catholic or Orthodox, is that, I mean, there are many people consider the Buddha to be a Catholic saint or a Christian saint, Saint Josephat, although technically it's not exactly true, because Saint Josephat is a corrupted form of one of the bodhisattvas' existences as detailed in a Jataka story. So there was like this Jataka story Jataka stories are like a genre of Buddhist literature, in which you take like an Aesop's fable, some kind of like a folk tale, probably that had existed in India since before the Buddhist time, a lot of them anyway, and then you just sort of tack on like a Buddhist moral at the end, and the Buddha saying that this character in the story was me in a former life, and that character was like Sariputta, and that character was Ananda, that kind of stuff. And one of these stories was so popular that it got translated into Arabic. Like when the Arabs, like the Muslims, were on the borders of India, maybe hadn't actually done much invading yet. And so they translated it into Arabic, where the word bodhisattva or bodhisatta became bodhisaf. And then it traveled westwards across caravan routes. By the time it got to like Georgia or Armenia, it was like Lodisaf. And then when it got to Greece, or the Greek-speaking world at the time, it became Yoasaf, which then in Latin became Josephatus, or in English, Josephat. And he was canonized as a saint in the Middle Ages. And I have been told that there is at least 2 churches dedicated to Saint Josephat. One's in Sicily, I think. The other one, I think, is maybe southern France or something. And a Catholic priest told me once that there was a monastery, a Christian monastery in Germany, that had a shrine to all the saints. The shrine to Saint Josephat was just a Buddha image, just sitting in meditation. But technically, it wasn't really the Buddha, because it was the Buddha in a previous incarnation, which Christians don't even believe in. Most Christians. Anyways, I mean, the reason why some Christians have this attitude, I mean, some of it's just right in the Bible. It's like the gospel according to John, I'm pretty sure, says that you can only attain the kingdom of heaven through Jesus. So anyone else is going to go to hell, except for maybe a few like Jewish patriarchs from the Old Testament. They might get into heaven just because they were, pre-Christian Jewish patriarchs, biblical ones. But one of the main reasons why Christianity has prospered as well as it has for over 1,000 years is simply hysterical intolerance. Like in ancient Rome, you had a very eclectic religious system. You had all kinds of different religions. It was paganism. One person's worshiping mainly this god. Another one is a votary of that goddess, Cybele. You got a worshiper of Cybele, and then you've got someone who is, a devotee of Apollo. And then you've got some guy who's a member of the Orphic Mysteries. You got another person down the road who worships the Egyptian goddess Isis. Then you've got some, Epicureans that don't worship any gods. And you've got, Stoic philosophers, and it was very eclectic, kind of like what Western civilization has become, starting like in the 20th century. But then Christianity came along, and they weren't willing to play ball that way. They weren't willing to share the playing field. It was like, only we are right. Everyone else is a devil worshiper. They just converted all the pagan gods and goddesses into demons. You're all going to burn in hell. I mean, they were quite willing to consign their own ancestors, their own recent ancestors, maybe their own parents, to eternal damnation, simply because they didn't follow the new belief system. And that hysterical intolerance actually is a winning strategy. If you're just too tolerant, then you just accept people that are not tolerant, and then they're just going to like force you out or just persecute you or whatever as soon as they get the opportunity. So hysterical intolerance is to some degree built into Christianity. You know, there's some of that, the roots of that are already found in the New Testament. And it has served Christianity well, I guess. You know, just like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He's talking about like the late empire when it was well into decline, well into like Christianity, where you would have just riots in the streets over, I mean, people literally killing each other, blood flowing in the street over like disagreements on whether the Holy Spirit emanates directly from the Father or it emanates indirectly from the Father through the Son. And that was like a major like dogmatic battle that went on in the late Roman Empire with literally people killing each other over it. When really, I mean, they couldn't possibly know this. It's just a matter of we gotta all believe the same thing. We have to be on exactly the same page. And it's hysterical intolerance combined with a certain amount of ignorance of other belief systems where you can just believe, you know, they're all just worshiping devils. I mean, you see that on X a lot, even just like might have even been today that I'm seeing that, you know, Islam is not a real religion. It's just like this like political cult, or it's the worship of Satan. There's people saying that on X, you know, that Islam is really a kind of devil worship. And I mean, I just can't go that far. You know, I can accept that Islam, the founder of Islam, was a kind of caravan bandit turned into a warlord, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that Muslims are like literally worshiping Satan. So, let's see, did I answer the question? How do I make sense of such warped views of Buddhism? It's mainly hysterical intolerance combined with ignorance of what Dharma is all about. And the best way to deal with it is just calmly explain things. And of course, in all likelihood, they're not going to accept the explanation very much, but at least you're not going to be fueling any kind of argument by, you know, getting heated and like arguing back at them, anything like that. So I guess I should just move on to the next question. As I say, there is kind of a longish list of questions. I mean, it's middle path between too many questions and not enough questions. So it's a good Buddhist Q&A here. And the next question is from Thought Fog. And Thought Fog says, would a monk be a valuable contribution to society worthy of food stamps? So, I mean, I don't fully understand this question. I mean, I assume Thought Fog is asking, are monks like an asset to the society such that we should be giving monks food stamps? And I mean, technically, food stamps, you don't associate that with people who are assets to society. You tend to associate food stamps with people that really aren't able to contribute much to society, and so they need to be like taking more than they give or some such. But the thing with, I mean, when I was a monk, people were like suggesting this kind of stuff to me too. You know, you should get like the free bus pass, and you should go on like EBT or food stamps or whatever it is. And it just didn't seem right as a monk. I mean, food stamps, you use them as money. You go to the store and buy food with food stamps, which, I mean, a monk should not be using money or anything that is used as money. So that would rule it out right there. Same thing with like the bus pass kind of a thing. If you're using it as money, in lieu of money, then it's technically a no-no. And so for a monk would be better off just like going to a food kitchen, going to a soup kitchen, that kind of thing, where you've got like generous people, generally not funded by the government. You know, this is like private charity as a general rule, who are just out of the goodness of their heart are helping people. And the monk would be associating with like homeless drug addicts and so forth. But I mean, and I consider that like a monk who is really homeless in America. I mean, there's a good chance he'd be living like in a homeless encampment with like mentally ill drug addicts, which, I mean, he wouldn't have much to steal, that kind of thing. So, I mean, certain monks with a certain kind of temperament, very benevolent kind of, social sort of temperament, might be able to do well in a homeless encampment, just going to a food kitchen for their food. I mean, I did know one monk who lived on the outskirts of San Diego, I think. He was staying in a wildlife refuge on the outskirts of San Diego, and every day he'd walk into a Christian soup kitchen to get his food. And they just put it into his bowl, and they were fine with that. So that would be more appropriate, I think, than using food stamps as a kind of substitute for money. But monks are a valuable contribution, but a valuable contribution to society, even though technically they're supposed to be, removed from society. They renounce society. They should not be particularly social. But private charity is much better than government largesse, socialism. Private charity is infinitely superior to socialism. Especially from a moral point of view or a spiritual point of view, where the person who is like engaging in private charity is gathering up treasures in heaven, to use Christian terminology. I mean, you're doing something meritorious. You're being generous, whereas just having the money automatically deducted from your paycheck and then squandered by some inefficient government bureaucracy is not nearly as beneficial, as a general rule. I assume there are exceptions to that. But yeah, go to a soup kitchen instead of going on food stamps if you are a monk in the West. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Dripwalker. And Dripwalker says, what do you think of Evola's take on anatta, or no self? It seems to me that he morphs the concept of not self or no self into some kind of weird higher self thing. And it has been a very long time since I've read Evola's take on Buddhism. I have read, the famous book, like the name of which I don't even remember, The Path to Awakening or something like that, in English. But yeah, it did seem to me that Evola does kind of glorify Buddhism. Like he's got the Buddhist arahant, the Buddhist enlightened being as some kind of Nietzschean Superman. So, I mean, he's taking Buddhism and trying to reconcile it with fascism. So you've got you have to have the Superman who is like the saint, the Buddhist saint. And yeah, I think that Dripwalker is correct that probably Evola just takes the no self thing and just kind of turns it into a unity with the higher self, sort of like the God man kind of a thing, which yeah, I think you do have to distort Buddhism at least a little bit to really reconcile it with Evola's preferred form of fascism. And by fascism, I don't necessarily mean capital F Italian fascism that had Mussolini as its leader. I'm just talking about small f fascism in general. So yeah, I really don't recall his take on no self well enough to really comment on it in any kind of detail. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Joe Doe. Speaking of fascism, Joe Doe says, do you think Hitler would have given a merciful death to Brian Ruhe on account of his bipolar disorder? If so, why did Brian ever support him? I'm asking as someone who has been labeled a schizophrenic. So that's another question. We gotta separate these. And while I'm separating these, I might as well say that I would prefer that people not use hyphens instead of dashes, because I go in and I have to change all the hyphens into dashes because it's just not good punctuation. It is wrong. So let's get back to Joe Doe's question. Do you think Hitler would have given a merciful death to Brian Ruhe on account of his bipolar disorder? I mean, it depends. I mean, would Hitler have actually known Brian Ruhe? I mean, would he have met Brian Ruhe? Then, I mean, he might have liked him. You know, Brian Ruhe would be a fanboy, probably. And so, I mean, Hitler wouldn't just be like having people executed that were like strenuously in his favor. So, I mean, he may have been completely merciful to him. I mean, there were some fairly nutty Nazis that were relatively high up in the pecking order. So it may be that Brian Ruhe would just, I mean, he'd be put in charge of the Nazi party in some remote province or something. Who knows? But it may be that if Hitler had never met Brian Ruhe, I mean, I don't know what his policies were with regard to people diagnosed with some mental disorder. That were they just thrown into concentration camps? It may be that, I mean, some of the really extreme cases, like criminally insane, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, but I really don't know enough about the social policies of the German National Socialist Workers' Party to know, I mean, what they did with people who just were like, I mean, they weren't a danger to anybody. You know, they're like the benevolent, kind of eccentric, weird person who may have this or that label attached to them from like a psychological perspective. But I think Hitler was he was tolerant of eccentric people, I'm pretty sure, so long as they weren't like opposing the Nazi party. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just kind of a weird question, seems to me. But I would like to think that that Brian Ruhe, if he existed, and Brian actually believes that he was, I think he was like a Luftwaffe pilot or something in National Socialist Germany in his previous life. So, I mean, in his previous life, I mean, he may have died in a plane crash or something, may have died in battle, but he wasn't put to death by the Nazi party, assuming that Brian is correct, that in his previous existence before this one, that he was actually was in Germany under Adolf Hitler. Adolf, as they would prefer. So, yeah, I mean, bipolar disorder, just, I think it was called manic depression back in those days. And yeah, I really don't think that he would have been seen as any kind of like deadwood in society, anything like that. So long as he was in favor of the party, that I'm sure that there's a good chance he would have found a place for him. Or just leave him alone and let him do his thing. So, I'm just going to move on to Jodo's next question, which is the second half of the first question. If so, why did Brian ever support him? I'm asking as someone who has been labeled a schizophrenic. Well, I mean, I don't know. Brian obviously would not consider himself to have been put to death by the, under the policies of the Führer. That he does believe that he was in Nazi Germany in his previous existence, and it prospered for him, except for eventually I think he did like die in a plane crash. His plane got shot down or something maybe. So, I mean, Brian supported him partly because Brian, bless his heart, I mean, he just cannot accept any official narrative. So, the official narrative is that Hitler was like just evil. So, I mean, Brian he's just going to go the other way. And I mean, partly, I mean, he did have like some kind of vision or something in his youth, which caused him to start, putting two and two together with regard to his previous existence as a Luftwaffe pilot. And Brian, I mean, he doesn't talk about National Socialism much anymore, partly because he's got so much grief from it. Just people, I mean, just shun him because of it. But I mean, he sincerely doesn't think that Hitler did anything wrong. You know, I don't think he'd go so far as to deny the Holocaust, but he would go along with somebody like David Irving, who, I think, is that his name, David Irving, who, you know, sort of like an alternate historian who, I mean, allows that, you know, that quite a lot of Jewish people and others did die under the German National Socialist Party in the 30s and first half of the 40s. But Hitler, according to Brian Ruhe, Hitler really didn't know about that. I mean, it was just, you know, his stuff that was going on. Hitler was just paying attention to other stuff. And, you know, it was going on, and Hitler did not order it, did not necessarily approve of it. Although at the end, I mean, a lot of Jewish people were dying at the end just from like typhus epidemics in the camps and just starvation, because towards the end of the war, things were getting so bad that the Germans could hardly even feed their own soldiers. So Brian supported, and to some degree maybe still supports, Adolf Hitler, because Brian sincerely does not believe that Adolf Hitler was like some evil psychopath, that he was just sort of like a hero who didn't do anything wrong, but is just the victim of negative propaganda and, you know, a certain ethnicity not liking him at all and kind of running the narrative and so forth, you know, pressuring the United States to get into the war and all that. So, I mean, it's kind of convoluted, as you might expect. But, yeah, Brian supports Hitler because he does not consider Hitler to have been an evil person. I mean, from even a Buddhist point of view, which is kind of strange. But, I mean, personally, I do not think that Hitler was a saint or a sage. But on the other hand, I don't think that he was as bad as Stalin, for example. Stalin killed more people than Hitler did. Mao killed more people than Stalin and Hitler combined. But it's quite okay to endorse Marxism still, even though Nazism, National Socialism, or just fascism in general is considered just to be like absolute evil. You know, even to just be associated with it is, you know, like people on the left will use that as a weapon against somebody, when really Marxism historically is responsible for way more deaths and more misery than all the forms of fascism combined. But I think I'm just toddling away from the topic here. So let's just go on to the next question. Also from Joe Doe. And this is kind of a good question. He says, now that Brian has been allowed back on YouTube after being kicked off like at least 12 times, can you restore the lost videos of you and his talks? And to tell you the truth, most of the videos that I did with Brian back when I was a monk, I never even put onto YouTube. For a while, I was just kind of uploading old videos with Brian, and I got about halfway through the list. We did a lot of videos, and then just kind of lost interest. And so I've got way more old videos of me and Brian on BitChute than on YouTube, because as Joe Doe here has implied, YouTube used to be pretty censorious. I got lots of videos taken down just because of just some casual mention of something in the past, whereas now, largely thanks to Donald Trump and Elon Musk, the censoriousness of social media has been lifted to a great degree. So you got people just like using the N-word on X, and it's fair game now, apparently. You can say that the 2020 election was rigged and not just lose your job or whatever. But yeah, so there's lots of old videos that never even got put onto YouTube. And most of them, I mean, there were a few because of those casual mentions and so forth, but a few of them did get taken down, but most of them that were put on YouTube were still up. It is true, unfortunately, that some of the videos that Brian and I did with Venerable Ajahn Punadhammo got taken down. Some of the most popular videos that I did, it was like a group discussion between Ajahn Punadhammo, Brian, and me about various topics. That some of those got taken down, and so yeah, Joe Doe is not the first person to suggest that those videos, especially the ones with Ajahn Punadhammo, should be like put back up on YouTube. Now that the symbolic book burnings of the Biden administration have passed, so let's just move on to the next question. This is from Jimmy Lad. And I suppose I could just start putting up old videos with Brian again, and especially the ones with Ajahn Punadhammo that got taken down. But I'm answering the question to Jimmy Lad now. Jimmy Lad says, where can we learn more about the concept of mind-generated karmic demons in the commentary tradition? So this is in response. This is in response to a statement I made in the previous Q&A, where the demons in hell in Buddhist cosmology are not real beings. They're just like holographic projections that are generated by the karma of the denizens of the hell realms. And how I learned about this is I happened to be at Pa'ak Doya in southern Burma visiting a German monk there. And I was just kind of curious about, I don't know if I brought this up with him or I brought it up elsewhere, and he just decided to respond to that while I was there. But I used to wonder where the demons in hell fit in the 31 planes of existence. You know, there is no demon realm really. There's the asuras, but never in the text does it say that it's asuras in hell that are like boiling people in pitch and like hacking them with axes and this kind of stuff. You know, the actual torturers in hell, there's not really a connection between them and the asura realm. So what are they? You know, I mean, would they just be denizens in hell that are like trustees, you know, just they get promoted because of good behavior so that they get to like torture everyone else, that kind of thing. You know, I was wondering about that. And this German monk told me that in the commentarial tradition, they're not real beings. They're just like, holographic projections. And he also said that the celestial nymphs in the heaven realms are the same way, which is kind of a ripoff. I mean, some people, they're doing this striving to get into heaven realms so they can have the harem of celestial nymphs. And it turns out the harem of celestial nymphs are all like, you know, celestial blow-up dolls or something. You know, there's not really a woman there, or a nymph, I should say. And I really don't know where in the commentaries. I mean, he was more orthodox than me. You know, he would scoff at my pernicious wrong views sometimes. You know, just in a very smug way. It's like, that's wrong because in this sutta the Buddha says this. You know, that was, as far as he was concerned, that was a conclusive refutation of any argument. It's like, the Buddha says this in this sutta, therefore you are wrong. You know, that was kind of his approach. And our friendship really didn't last an extremely long time. Partly just because of that attitude of his, or just this smug kind of attitude. But I assume that he is correct, that somewhere in the commentarial tradition, it mentions that the demons in hell and the celestial nymphs in heaven really are not conscious beings, that they're just a kind of projection. But I really don't know where in the commentaries you can find it. There's a good chance that AI is sophisticated enough. You could ask Grok, you know, where in the Pali Atagatas it mentions this, and Grok might actually be able to come up with an answer. But I mean, I really have not read a whole lot of commentarial tradition. I mean, the Visuddhimagga, I've read the Visuddhimagga, which is sort of like the central hub of the Pali commentarial tradition. And I've read some of the, you know, like the Jataka stories, not just the verses, but the stories, and also the stories to like the ghost stories, the Peto Watu and so forth. Technically, that's commentary. It's just the verses that are scripture or canonical. So I have read some commentary, but not a whole lot. I never had a whole lot of use for the commentary. Sometimes if you're reading Vinaya, there's just like this obscure word that is not a common word in Pali. In fact, sometimes you'll find a word that's found only in the entire Tipitaka, only in this passage, and you don't really have enough context to know what it means. Therefore, sometimes you can look into the commentary and see what the commentary says and still take it with a grain of salt, because sometimes the commentators didn't know either, and so they just would make a wild guess without admitting that they were making a wild guess. That happens in the commentarial tradition sometimes. You've got monks from South India and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, that are trying to interpret like cultural, how do you say it? Like cultural norms, and also like flora and fauna of North India centuries previously. And sometimes they just guess, and they don't admit that they're guessing. So let's see here. Yeah, so where can we learn more about the concept of mind-generated karmic demons and celestial nymphs in the commentary tradition? Yeah, you just get, it's in there, I'm pretty sure, but I really don't know exactly which commentary states it. And there's lots of commentaries. Every text in the Pali Tipitaka has its commentaries. So good luck finding it, unless you can find some expert on the commentaries, or maybe AI or something could locate it for you. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yoshibui. And Yoshibui asks a good question. Did Gautama Buddha commit an offense when he proclaimed to the general public that he was enlightened? And this is following up on a statement I made in the previous Q&A that for a monk to proclaim his enlightenment, or even to proclaim that he has attained jhana, to a layperson is forbidden. It is against the rules, even if it's true. I mean, if it's false, then he's excommunicated for life. If he's knowingly lying about having attained superhuman mental states, which would include enlightenment, but also would include like psychic powers and even jhana, like deep meditative states. If he's telling the truth, it's still against the rules, because monks aren't supposed to be bragging to lay people about this kind of stuff. So did the Buddha commit an offense when he proclaimed to the general public that he was enlightened? Technically, yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you? In fact, there's also, it's a similar rule that a monk isn't supposed to perform psychic powers. He's not supposed to do miracles in front of lay people. Whereas the Buddha, I mean, his most outstanding flouting of that rule was the so-called twin miracle, where the Buddha levitated up into the air, and then he started spraying water out of one half of his body and fire out of the other half. And then he would switch it up so that the side that was spraying water is now spraying fire, and vice versa. And then he switched it up so that it became like the top half and the bottom half, while he's levitating in the sky in order to impress these Brahmins with his psychic powers. And it just flies in the face of repeated admonitions that you find in the text, where monks aren't supposed to do that kind of stuff. But I mean, in that case, I think that the twin miracle probably is mythology, stuff that got added later, and the people who added it considered including this miracle to be more important than the Buddha following his own rules. And it could be, I mean, it is more plausible anyway that the Buddha would go around saying that he was enlightened, declaring himself to be the Buddha, although in the text he generally refers to himself as the Tathagata, which doesn't necessarily claim that he's enlightened. It just means that he has attained the state of suchness or thusness, and which kind of implies that he's enlightened, but I mean, in a way it could be a kind of euphemism. But it's really hard to say, to what extent the Pali texts are reliable, objective history, and to what extent they're like paraphrased, and to what extent, it's just like mythology gets added in. And just because it seems plausible doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. I mean, that's one thing that really struck me as a monk, is that some Western monks are very intelligent. You know, it's like generally most Buddhist monks, Western Buddhist monks, have like a college education. You know, it's intelligent, open-minded people. And so they have to kind of admit, it's kind of embarrassing, maybe bad taste or bad manners for them to admit that the texts are wrong about like the earth being flat and floating on water, that kind of thing. But so they're willing to kind of dismiss the fire-breathing cobra dragons and the flat earth floating on water and eclipses of the sun and moon being caused by an asura named Rahu swallowing them into his mouth, that kind of thing. But when it gets to the actual philosophy stuff, then they think, well, it's completely reliable. But what are the odds that all the fake stuff is going to be obviously fake? Or all the false stuff is going to appear to be obviously false to a Westerner in the 20th or 21st century? That probably most of the fake stuff that gets added, the spurious contents of the suttas and so forth, is stuff that might seem reasonable. You know, it might seem entirely possible, including stuff like the Buddha not just bragging grandiosely. I mean, that kind of stuff I consider to be fake, but even just to admit that he was enlightened, I mean, it kind of goes against other teachings in the suttas, and it's something that could easily be added. So, but let's just get all this ambivalence or vagary. No, that's a different. That vagary doesn't mean vagueness, does it? Let's just set that aside and just take the text at face value. Just assume that it's all true. Then, I mean, did he commit an offense by claiming to the general public that he was enlightened, or did he commit an offense by performing miracles in public in front of lay people? It would be against the precepts that he laid down, but you could say that the Buddha himself was exempt because he's the one that makes the rules. You know, it's sort of like some totalitarian dictator can't really break the law because he is the law. What he says goes, and if he says this is the law for everybody except me, then who's gonna deny that? Who's gonna say, no, Mr. Dictator, you got to follow your own laws? And then, of course, you wind up in a camp or something. Not that the Buddha was a totalitarian dictator, but when he's the one who's laying down the rules, I mean, he's the creator of the system, then it may be that he has some leeway that he can fudge on his own rules. But yeah, that is, with regard to the miracles, I can be skeptical that the Buddha really did perform the twin miracle, for example. But with regard to calling himself fully enlightened, it's possible that he didn't, like historically, and then that stuff just got attributed to him later on. It may be that he really did call himself the Tathagata, but that would be a kind of, I don't know, it's in a way sort of sidestepping claims to full enlightenment by just saying, I've attained thus. You know, I am what I am, kind of a thing. But technically, yeah, it would be against the rules. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this isn't really a question. This is from Maitreya Buddha. And he just made a statement in the comments under the previous YouTube video that I might as well comment on it because it just seems like something that I should comment on. Maitreya Buddha says, your current job seems to disturb and pollute your mind. It is my belief that you should become a philosophy instructor at a local community college. You would probably make a greater salary than you already make. So the reason why he said that is probably because I mentioned in the previous Q&A that every once in a while I'll get like these semi-nightmares associated with work. You know, it's just like this never-ending work that has to be done. You know, I operate a forklift, I load and unload truck trailers. And, sometimes I'll have these dreams of just keep loading and loading, and it's just the freight just keeps appearing, or else the freight doesn't have like a pro code. You can't scan it to know where it's supposed to go, that kind of thing, but you have to do something with it. Just these kind of sort of like school anxiety dreams happen. And I mean, most people probably have school anxiety dreams, at least in the West, people that have actually attended like high school. And I mean, I've had weird anxiety dreams about like airports, like the bad guy chasing you through an airport, that kind of thing. But it is true. My current job is an aggravating, sometimes stressful job. And I got to fix my collar again. Let's see, go like that. Okay. So, I mean, to some degree, and a lot of it is just, I'm not really a social person. I was a hermit for many years, just literally like a recluse for many years. And now I'm just surrounded by people. And like I mentioned before, the average IQ of the people working on that dock is probably below 90. And so you got a certain amount of like blockheads that you're dealing with, people that just mess things up. And there's just lots of it. They're just people just swarm, forklifts just swarming sometimes, and when it's really busy. 20 forklifts all on the same dock, just everybody getting in everybody else's way. So, yeah, I mean, it can be an aggravating, unpleasant job. I do admit that. In a way, it's like a kind of ascetic practice, but it's not a very spiritually advanced ascetic practice, just because the whole, like, psychic atmosphere of the place is not very high, let's say. So then Maitreya Buddha says that it's his belief that I should become a philosophy instructor at a local community college. And yeah, I've considered that. My sweetheart has suggested similar stuff. Like there's a place called Bob Jones University here in Greenville, South Carolina. And, she was telling me I should try to get a job there. But it turns out Bob Jones is like a Christian school. And I wouldn't really be able to teach comparative religion there very well, especially because I applied there once for a forklift job, working in their warehouse for moving around pallets of books or something. I don't know. And in order to get a job there, you had to avow that you declare Christ to be your savior and Mary was a virgin and all this. And I just couldn't do that. I wasn't going to lie and say, oh yeah, I'm a believing Christian. But it's my understanding that community college instructors probably don't make a whole heck of a lot of money. I mean, I'm not rich at all, and I'm still working on an hourly wage, but still, I mean, I'm living a relatively comfortable life up until some disaster strikes. And one of the main advantages of the current job I've got, I get a lot of physical exercise. I got to get off the forklift again and again. I'm like climbing around like a squirrel or a monkey on this freight that's loaded into the trailers in order to like strap stuff to the wall and secure it and everything. I got to lift up heavy things, and so I get exercise, which is good because I'm not good at artificial exercise. I'm not good at like working out. So natural exercise is good for my body, even if it's causing me a certain amount of frustration and aggravation. But being a philosophy instructor at a local community college, I mean, it's possible. Yeah, maybe when I get too old to be climbing around like a monkey and lifting heavy weights, I might actually look into that. But I'm probably not going to be looking for a different job anytime soon unless something radical happens. And I'm just going to move on to the next question because that wasn't even really a question. I didn't even have to answer that one. So this is from someone whose name apparently is spelled in Cyrillic characters. And I think it is pronounced something like Dayanch Zamnal, which in English translates, according to Google Translate, into ascetic journey. So let's just call this person ascetic journey. An ascetic journey says, They say Buddha taught two truths, mundane and supramundane. But did Buddha really teach any mundane truths? Well, yeah, of course he did. In fact, pretty much everything that he taught, like verbally, was mundane truth. Because in Buddhism, there are the two truths. You've got Samudhi Sacha, or conventional truth, and you've got Paramattha Sacha, or ultimate truth. And when you're talking about people, for example, I, you, him, her, they, them, we, us, any kind of talking about people, that's always conventional truth, because ultimately there is no self. And like almost everything you talk about in regular language, I mean, it's dealing with conventional truth. It's not dealing with the absolute. It's not dealing with ultimate truth. It is true that according to that Abhidhamma scholars consider Abhidhamma to be ultimate truth, but I don't believe that for 1 second. I don't think that ultimate truth can be put into words at all. Any truth that you tell with words is going to be conventional truth. Like the Tao Te Ching says, the name that can be named is not the eternal name. The highest truth cannot be symbolized. If you symbolize it like with words, it's not the highest truth anymore. It's just symbols. Like the Kantian thing in itself cannot be explained in words. I mean, you can kind of dance around it a little bit, sort of like Buddhists dance around nirvana a little bit, trying to explain it, but you really can't, so you just keep your efforts to a minimum, really. So the Buddha spoke in Panyati, or Wohara Desana, which is just like language of the world that, I mean, you have to use because you're in the world, you're a human being. So you've got to use this symbolic stuff. You've got to have this weird convention where the sound tree symbolizes this big plant outside. I mean, what are the similarities between the sound tree and an actual tree? I mean, we don't even know what an actual tree is like because we're symbolizing it even by seeing it and perceiving it. So it'd be maybe a better question is, did the Buddha really teach any ultimate truths? Because all he can do is just kind of point the way. And there's like that Zen story. I think it's one of the famous koans where the Buddha started the patriarchal succession by one day, instead of saying anything, at the time when he usually delivers his sermons to the monks, instead he just sits there in front of everybody with this flower, and he's just twirling the flower between his fingers like this. And the only person who got it was Mahakassapa, or Kasyapa, who smiled because he understood, whereas nobody else did. And I mean, the whole point of it is you can't really teach ultimate truth in words. So the Buddha was just kind of twirling a flower to try and silently convey something that words can't convey. And that was like the beginning of Zen Buddhism. According to, Zen people, that's when Zen Buddhism began, when the Buddha gave his flower discourse, when he didn't say anything. He just sat there twirling a flower or a paper umbrella. So, yeah, the Buddha really did teach lots of mundane truths. And the better question is, did he teach any ultimate truths? And he couldn't do it directly. He couldn't do it using words. All he can do is show the way, and then you've got to find out for yourself. It's like somebody who's never tasted vanilla before asking you what vanilla tastes like. It's like, what are you going to say? You could sit there and explain to this person what vanilla tastes like for hours till you're just exhausted and hoarse. They're still not going to have a clue. They still won't know what vanilla tastes like. The only way to tell us or to teach someone what vanilla tastes like is you just give them instructions. You go and get some vanilla and taste it, and then you'll know what vanilla tastes like. Because even if you have like a master's degree or a doctorate in chemistry, you've worked out all the the neuronal pathways and whatever it takes, how the molecules in the vanilla like interact with your taste buds and how the perception is formed in your brain and all that, still you can't explain what vanilla tastes like. I mean, you could know all that chemical stuff, and if you haven't tasted vanilla yourself, you're still not going to know. So the Buddha just taught the way on how to know the highest, like, super mundane, ultimate truth, because it cannot be put into words. And I'm just going to move on to Ascetic Journey's second question, which is, what percentage of the Patimokkha are Silabbata Paramasa in your opinion? See, the Patimokkha is like the 227 rules for a bhikkhu. There's more for nuns, and some other schools of Buddhism have different numbers. But it's like the standard list of rules of monastic discipline that have to be recited every 2 weeks at monasteries, or supposedly they're supposed to be recited every 2 weeks at monasteries, on the full moon and the new moon days. And Silabbata Paramasa literally means like clinging to morality and observances. So, I mean, really, the commentaries really don't understand Silabbata Paramasa. It's one of those words that got distorted by the commentaries and like misinterpreted by the commentaries, so that like dogmatic Orthodox Theravada Buddhists don't know what Silabbata Paramasa is because they follow the commentaries. And in my opinion, the commentaries are wrong. The commentaries, usually Silabbata, it translates into English as like rites and rituals, but really Sila means morality, and Bata or Vata means observances. So really it's clinging to morality and observances. And if you read the Patimokkha, it warns against clinging even to like genuine morality. That if you think that keeping 5 precepts is going to get you enlightened, that's clinging to rites and rituals. If you're just clinging to this, you're like attached to following these rules, even though they're valid moral rules. Don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, that kind of thing. Then if you're still clinging to that, that's still Silabbata Paramasa, even though the commentarial tradition has interpreted in this weird way. Like the standard example of Silabbata Paramasa in the commentaries is the dog ascetics and the bovine ascetics that lived in the Buddhist time, who would imitate animals, is in the hope that they would become enlightened through that. It's like some people think that cows are just naturally enlightened. They just naturally follow 5 precepts. They don't kill, they don't steal, they don't lie, that kind of thing. And so by imitating cows or dogs, just going around on all fours and just like grazing, not speaking human languages, that kind of thing, that is like the commentarial, practically the definition is by behaving like a dog or behaving like a cow. But if you read the Patimokkha and you really look into these things, then the Buddha really was warning against clinging even to valid morals. Don't cling to anything. Sort of like Ajahn Chah used to say, right view becomes wrong view if you cling to it. So, in that sense, the Patimokkha rules themselves are not clinging to anything. It's not Silabbata Paramasa because, some monks are obsessed with Vinaya, and so they cling to all the rules, and so it'd be 100%. Other monks, either they're enlightened or completely shameless, and they don't cling to any of the rules, so it'd be 0%. So that would be more subjective. The Silabbata Paramasa, especially the Paramasa, the clinging part, that's just, that's subjective. That's not in the rules themselves. So I think what Ascetic Journey really is asking is what percentage of the Patimokkha are Vata and not Sila. The Vata is just observances, it's just etiquette. Whereas the Sila is real Sila. So, there's a monk's rule that you're not supposed to kill animals. It's a pachidia offense to kill an animal. Whether it's a mosquito or an elephant, it's the same offense. Well, I mean, that's still sila, but vata, or just observances, it's like some of them are serious rules, like sangha disesa rules. The most serious category of offense is if you build a hut that's more than certain dimensions, more than like 7.5 feet by like 5 feet, they're tiny hut. If you build anything bigger than that, then that's a sangha disesa offense. So that would be more of an observance, because it's not really immoral to build a big hut. And in fact, if you're building it for yourself, it's not allowed to be that big. But if it's like for the sangha, if I remember correctly, somebody's willing to donate it to the sangha, then it can be bigger than those dimensions. Or just shaving your head, wearing robes of a certain material and a certain color, those are just observances. Not eating in the afternoon is just an observance. There's nothing inherently immoral with eating dinner any more than eating breakfast. So if you ask that way, what percentage of the Patimokkha are observances and not morality, that they're just like ancient Indian ascetic etiquette, then I would guess probably more than half of them. I mean, I'd have to go through one by one in order to really make like a precise kind of estimate. But maybe 2/3 of them. It's like there's some of these rules. It's like the Nesigiya Pachitya rules. It's like your sitting cloth has to have a certain percentage of, can't have more than a certain percentage of black goat wool in it, this kind of thing. Or you're not allowed to carry goat wool more than a certain distance. This sort of thing. I mean, it's even handling money. I mean, technically, there's nothing immoral with regard to holding a dollar bill in your hand. I mean, that's not immoral, but it's against the rules. So, yeah, I'd say at least 2/3 of the Patimokkha rules and Vinaya rules in general, because most Vinaya rules are not in the Patimokkha. They're beyond, they're just additional to the Patimokkha. Then, yeah, I'd guess at least 2/3, probably more than 2/3 of the rules are just observances instead of morality. But when you start like trying to get rid of the observances to make like monastic discipline more amenable to Western civilization or something, then you're just fucking shit up. Once you open the door to changing stuff, then people are just going to keep changing and changing and changing until it's just unrecognizable. It's foobar. So you're better off just dealing with the inconvenience of following ancient Indian rules. If you want to be a Theravada monastic, then you just follow the rules, preferably without clinging to them too much. At first, you're going to cling to them just to get them down. You don't want to break the rules, but then it could become second nature after a couple years, and then you don't have to cling to anything anymore, and it's just automatic pretty much. Whether it's moral or just observances. So I'm just going to move on to Ascetic Journey's next question is, do you like Putin? And I've never met the man personally, but I really don't have anything against him. I mean, supposedly he's like a gangster. He's this ruthless person that has his political opponents arrested and or assassinated, that kind of thing. But I mean, as a world leader, as a national leader, I mean, I think that, America could be friends with Russia and Putin. I don't, and they could be allies. I don't see how Putin's any worse than the leader of China or a number of other leaders I could mention. I mean, I would prefer Putin to van der Leyen. At least Putin's still got he's got an intact pair of testicles. So, yeah, Putin probably is relatively good for Russia. I think the whole Ukraine thing, it's just bleeding resources and money and manpower and stuff for Russia for a long time. But, yeah, I think Putin is probably, if he's leading Russia towards an improved state over the way it was before him, then he must be doing something okay. Of course, you could say the same thing about Stalin. I mean, Stalin pretty much industrialized Russia, but Stalin was not a good guy. And so, I mean, with regard to like a political leader, and this applies to Trump too, I mean, in a way you have to like differentiate between like, is he a nice person? Is he a good person? And then is he a good leader? Because a good leader isn't necessarily a nice guy. And a nice guy certainly is not necessarily a good leader. Like Jimmy Carter was probably a nice guy, relatively speaking. But history has laid down the verdict that he was not a good president. Or like, what's his name? Valentinian the Great. He was a Roman emperor, like around the year, like the late 300s. And I mean, he was just a sociopath. He was just this cruel, sadistic bastard of a human being, but he got the name the Great. He didn't call himself that. It was other people who were calling him the Great, because even though he was a sadistic, sociopathic bastard who would have people put to death, beaten to death with clubs or whatever, just for making like a minor, trivial mistake, still, he was doing his best to serve Rome and lead Rome to greatness and kind of undo some of the mistakes that his predecessors made. And Rome was prospering under him. So he was a good leader, despite the fact that he was a cruel, sadistic, sociopathic bastard. But getting back to Putin, I've got nothing against the man, tell you the truth. I do think it would be good if the United States and Russia could be allies instead of, you've got some kind of status quo establishment that wants to just keep the Cold War going, but they can't really have a Cold War against our real adversary, which is China. China is a greater threat to America than Russia is, but it's just, we've got doing too much business. They're selling us all this, cheap electronics and stuff that we can't badmouth China very much, even though they're a greater threat to the United States than Russia is. So with regard to Putin, yeah, he's all right. In a way, I kind of like Putin, kind of. But I really don't know lots and lots about him. And I'm sure he is just a ruthless person, not as bad as Valentinian the Great. And I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, do you think the dude is an American version of a renunciant semi-enlightened being? And he's referring to the Big Lebowski. I can't remember. Is it Jeff Bridges plays the dude in the Big Lebowski? So do I think he was an American version of a renunciant semi-enlightened being? He might be sort of like a Hollywood attempt at portraying somebody like that, but I mean, he wasn't really semi-enlightened. He had a certain wisdom, sort of like a certain kind of, hippie wisdom to him. And he was relatively patient, He had a certain amount of Christian charity towards other people. He wasn't really confrontational. He wasn't a cruel person. He was a relatively good person with a certain amount of wisdom, but I don't think that he was really like a semi-enlightened being. Maybe that's what Hollywood was trying to portray, but it didn't. I really don't think so. So, PSA's second question. On which stage of the path would you categorize someone like that? Putujana. I would consider him to be a Putujana, which means he is not in any of the 4 stages of Buddhist sainthood. But then again, I'm skeptical with regard to pretty much all of the stages of Buddhist sainthood. Even like arahantship to some degree, because within the context of samsara, it may be just at best a kind of paradox. And I do think that the other stages, Sotapanna and so forth, originally had different meanings before somebody crafted them into this system of the 4 stages of like Buddhist Aryahood. I do not think that the Buddha himself advocated the 4 stages. But that's just my opinion. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Master Po. And Master Po says, on hope, don't you hope the Buddhist point of view on reality is true? I mean, there might be a certain subliminal level of hope with regard to that. But in Buddhism, they talk more about confidence. But in my case, I mean, the Buddhist point of view is not ultimately true. So, I mean, just going with conventional truth and ultimate truth, like I was talking about before, I mean, it's not ultimately true. There's a certain amount of delusion involved in believing anything. So that kind of kicks that in the head a little bit. But I do use a lot of Buddhism as a working hypothesis, a very convenient working hypothesis that seems to work well. It works better, in my opinion, than, say, scientific realism. Although, to some degree, a certain amount of scientific realism is also a good thing. It does result in a rather robust point of view. So hope, like I was saying in the previous Q&A, is desire. It's like you want something to be the case. And I don't know, it's not really a matter of like craving, in my opinion. It's just sort of a convenient working hypothesis that I have been benefiting from for many years at this point. But yeah, there could be, I mean, to the extent that I do hope Buddhism is true, and I really don't feel it, but to the extent if I do have that at some subliminal level, it would be a kind of subliminal unenlightenment. So I'm just going to move on to Master Po's second question, which is like a follow-up on the first one. He says, whatever one's worldview is, it takes hope. Faith and hope go hand in hand. Does it not? So that's the only actual question at the end, is go hand in hand. And faith and hope don't necessarily go hand in hand, but both of them are delusional. Faith is delusional. Faith is belief, and belief is thinking that you know something that you don't really know. Faith, I mean, you're never going to know the Kantian thing in itself, which is actual truth, actual reality. You're never going to know that through faith, unless it's like St. John of the Cross's dark faith. I mean, St. John of the Cross had this phenomenon called dark faith, and it was based on like profound, like what a Buddhist would call jhana, I guess. It's sort of like a Christian version of that. High contemplation, he called it, where you just dismiss everything from your mind that is not God. So you can't imagine God, so out goes the imagination. You can't sense God through the senses, out go the sense, the whole sensory apparatus. You can't reason out God. You can't figure out God intellectually, out goes the intellect. So you just dismiss all these mental states, all these perceptions, until everything that isn't God is dismissed. And then you realize there's still something there in your mind. After you've dismissed everything that can be dismissed, still there's something there. And according to St. John of the Cross, that's like the Spirit of God, and that is dark faith. It's like, it's beyond mere intellectual belief or emotional belief. It's, you just know it, which in a way is not really faith. I guess the New Testament, like St. Paul in the New Testament says, that Christianity, I mean, he honestly admits Christianity is based on faith rather than knowledge, because if you really know it, then you don't need faith anymore. Faith is this belief. In a way, it's hoping something is true, I guess. But both faith and hope are unenlightened mental states, in my opinion. The term sada in Pali is often translated as faith, but some Western translators don't like that, and they'll replace the word faith with like confidence. And then there are at least 2 verses in the suttas that say that a monk shouldn't have faith. One is in the Dhammapada, and then another one is in the Atthakavagga, where you just don't have faith. And I agree with that, because faith is belief, and belief is delusion. Belief is samsara. Perception is samsara. So you can say faith and hope go hand in hand, but both of them are going hand in hand down some samsaric path. They may eventually get you to enlightenment, but before you become enlightened, you're going to have to dismiss the faith and hope. And once you're enlightened, you're not going to have any faith or hope. At least that's what the texts imply. So let's see here. Yeah, well, I mean, Master Po does say whatever one's worldview is, it takes hope and maybe faith, but a worldview is ultimately delusional. You know, it's like a perceptual belief system, and perceptual belief systems are samsara. I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, have you read the protocols of the learned elders of Zion? We got kind of a Nazi-esque theme going here. Dhamma River, I kind of interrupted myself, which is rather rude. So I'm just going to go back to Dhamma River here saying, have you read the protocols of the learned elders of Zion? Could you share your thoughts? No, I have not read the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. I have read about them a little bit, where supposedly it's kind of like like a hoax. You know, it's sort of a fraudulent thing that was based on a novel that was written considerably earlier than the protocols were. That a large part of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion is supposedly based on a novel that was written much earlier. And that's about all I know about it. I mean, it's a lot of the sort of the so-called anti-Semites out there will, you know, cite the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which supposedly has like the agenda for the Jews to, like, you know, undermine Western civilization and take control and all that. But I mean, I've never bothered to read it, and probably never will. And I do think that to some degree it's like propaganda. Not necessarily like Hebrew propaganda, but more like anti-Hebrew propaganda. That's just what little I know about it. And so I'm just going to move on to Dhamma River's next question, which is, I watched the interview with you and Brian Ruhe, how social justice is practically the opposite of Buddhism, and they don't want men to be men. And you mentioned how you used to have a Dutch friend who stopped being your friend when she realized you were leaning towards the right. It reminded me of a young liberal white Canadian feminist friend I used to have. She was going to university at the time and told me she was working on a project with other people to send men to a place like a concentration camp where men could be re-educated on how to be men. I thought she was joking, but she was dead serious. What are your thoughts and feelings on being sent to a concentration camp to be re-educated on how to be a man? And your teacher is a young white liberal feminist from Canada. Well, that Dutch friend who stopped being my friend when she realized I was leaning towards the right, she was actually the one who inadvertently red-pilled me. Because one time she sent me a link from, it was Black Pigeon Speaks. It was some video from Black Pigeon Speaks. This is back in like 2015, about how women and like feminism, like women involved in politics, destroys civilizations. And she was kind of confused by it. She asked for my opinion, and I watched it, and it just, like on the sidebar on YouTube, you get all this "you may also like" kind of stuff, suggested viewings, and I start watching like Sargon of Akkad and like Stefan Molyneux and people like that, and that just it was like 3 days of just horrified fascination, just seeing how insane the left had gone. And it pretty much cured me of any leftward leanings or tendencies to vote Democrat. And so, I mean, I would remind her occasionally, like, this is because of you. I'm red pilled because of you. Yeah, that pretty much ended that. But let's see where. Oh yeah, and this same person shared with me a paper that she had written for some university class in Europe about redefining masculinity, and it was like the alternatives to like patriarchal toxic masculinity were all men becoming like more empathetic and like nurturing and non-aggressive and so forth. So essentially redefining masculinity into femininity. You know, it's like every option that was given in the paper was like 2 or 3 options, 2 or 3 alternatives were just like men becoming more feminine. So that was really a thing, and it's going on in universities, maybe not quite as much as in 2015 when it was really just reaching like a fever pitch. But yeah, I think this pendulum is starting to swing the other way now. But let's get to the actual question here. What are your thoughts and feelings on being sent to a concentration camp to be re-educated on how to be a man? And your teacher is a young white liberal feminist from Canada. Yeah, I mean, it would depend on the circumstances, I suppose. I don't think I'd be a very good subject. You know, I don't think they would succeed in really changing my point of view, other than maybe just making me even more vehemently non-feminist. It reminds me of, there was some old science fiction movie, kind of science fiction movie. It's like a dystopian kind of movie from like the late 1970s. And it was some actor that was specialized in like B movies. John Saxon, I think, was the star of it. And he winds up in like this postmodern feminist society where the men are treated like slaves and they're fed this, I mean, their food is laced with this drug that makes them very like beta and passive and subservient and everything, to just so that the women can keep the men under control. And this John Saxon guy, he just kind of stops eating the food and eventually just like rebels, you know. And of course, in these shows, it's inevitable that like one of the female leaders, you know, one of these butch feminists who's like just taking charge and running everything, she's secretly like the plaything of some ultra masculine barbarian on the outskirts of society, that kind of thing. They always fall for like the super macho hero guy. So I might be something like that John Saxon guy, where, you know, I'd be just sort of biding my time. I mean, just like these kind of feminists, they just really overestimate their own power. They don't like the idea that feminism has become a thing in the West simply because men allowed it to happen. That women couldn't just seize power without men consenting to it. Because men are stronger than women as a general rule. At least with regard to, you know, like aggression, that kind of stuff. So, what are my thoughts and feelings on being sent to a concentration camp to be re-educated on how to be a man? In other words, how to be a eunuch would be what they would be teaching. And your teacher is a young white liberal feminist from Canada. Yeah, I don't know. It would depend on the liberal feminist and all that. It would just depend on the circumstances, on how I would navigate the situation. I'm going to move on to the next question here. This is from Cyrus Frame, one of the few people who asks questions on Rumble. And Cyrus Frame says, in the Atthakavagga, there are these lines. If by view purity is for a man, or by knowledge he abandons unease, then he who is already encumbered is purified by something extra. Indeed, the view betrays him, claiming in that way. And I commend Cyrus Frame for using my own translation of the Atthakavagga. That was my translation of the following Pali here. And I'm going to use Burmese pronunciation, so it's going to sound weird. De tena se thodit naratha hodit, Jnanina watho pazahadi dokam. Inyena tho thozadi tho padiko deti heat nam bawa data wadanam. So, Cyrus Frame continues here. What I understand by the first line is that some people pursue purity through views. The second line, some people chase knowledge to gain comfort, which reminds me of Jeremy Hillary Boob in the Nowhere Man scene in Yellow Submarine. However, I do not understand the last two lines. Okay, so let's just go over this verse from the Atthakavagga. If by view purity is for a man, which means that people in ancient India and nowadays, like some Christians, believe that you're going to become enlightened or reach the fullness of your potential by believing the right belief. And then so the next line is, or by knowledge he abandons unease. And really, these are just, they mean the same thing. If by view purity is for a man, or by knowledge he abandons unease, is essentially saying, if by view purity isn't for a man, which is to say, by knowledge he abandons unease. So either way, it's like your beliefs are getting you into a state of purity. You know, sort of like jnana yoga in Hinduism or in yoga, where it's like you realize the truth, that, and the truth is some kind of like perceptual worldview. It's not just like some ineffable like void. You know, it's not like that. It's you have realized truths. You know, you have understood, you know, the laws of reality, this kind of thing. It's not just like dismissing all perception. It's still perceptual, apparently. So, getting to the third line, then he who is already encumbered is purified by something extra, which means, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, your beliefs are what are preventing you from being enlightened. Your beliefs are weighing you down. You are encumbered by views and perceptions and beliefs. And the Atthakavagga just says over and over again, don't have views, perceptions, or beliefs. So you're encumbered, you're weighed down by all these ideas, these unenlightened perceptions. And you think you're going to be purified by just having a different perception. You think that you're already weighed down by these beliefs, but you just add a few more beliefs to just sort of pull it all together, like the rug in the Big Lebowski. You know, it pulls the room together. Really, you're just more encumbered. You're just more weighed down by beliefs. By adding some new belief, I mean, you're just even more weighed down. Even if you get rid of some of the old beliefs to make room for the new belief, you're still just encumbered by these clingings to views. And so the last line is, indeed, the view betrays him, claiming in that way, because you're saying that I'm unenlightened, which means I have delusional views, but I just add some new delusional view because all views are just by nature delusional. They're all samsaric. That you're not going to become enlightened by just clinging to any worldview or any system of worldviews. I mean, there's plenty of Orthodox Buddhist dogmatic scholars out there who just cling to what the Buddha taught, and still they're not enlightened. They just don't get it. So that's what it means. I mean, it's like if you think that by knowing the right thing or having the right belief system is going to get you enlightened, then the belief system is really what's keeping you from being enlightened. So in a way, it's just self-contradictory. And I hope I explained that well enough, because I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, how to deal with injustice at work. There was a big promotion recently in my office. They promoted some 10 people. I didn't get the promotion, but what hurts more is not that I didn't get a promotion, but people who I have trained got it before me, and with due respect, they are not on my level when it comes to being effective and getting things done. So Nirmit knows way better than I do, like why they might have been promoted, even if he was more qualified to be promoted. Like he was the one who was teaching them and still knows more than them. I mean, it could be like a DEI stuff. It could be nepotism. There could be, these kind of reasons, just sort of like village politics or something. It's like, well, we need more women in upper management, so we'll just promote, her and her and her, that kind of thing. I don't really know what the details are, but I mean, if you work for a place that has unjust systems like that, then you might consider just moving elsewhere, just getting a different job somewhere else. I mean, that's kind of what I was doing. The place I worked at before, the place where I'm working at now, the upper management was largely incompetent. And one of the reasons why they were incompetent, there were a lot of like college educated white women that were just hired just largely through DEI. And there's a lot of like pro-gay stuff. This was like, we're making construction materials. And it would not have surprised me if there was like some decree came from above that we're going to be flying gay pride flags over these shops selling construction materials, which would just obviously would tank business, because most construction workers, people that buy like metal roofing and so forth, they really tend to be more conservative in South Carolina anyhow than elsewhere. Or than you go to Starbucks and it's just kind of what you expect, but you want to go buy metal roofing. I mean, you don't really care about gay pride and all that. And the upper management was really supportive of that kind of thing, and just bragging about how Newsweek magazine found their business to be one of the most inclusive, progressive kind of businesses to work for. And I mean, it was like a kind of groupthink going on, so that like people that actually had good ideas they'd either get fired or leave. And it was just the people that agreeing with the agenda, that would stay. And things just got worse and worse until finally I just had enough and I was gone. But again, I don't know what the situation is in Nirmit's place of business. What is the motivation for them to be hiring people that are less qualified and overlooking people who are more qualified? I mean, in America, the usual explanation for that would be like diversity hires, or sometimes it would be like nepotism or that kind of thing too. So, yeah, I mean, if it's either you can just have equanimity, just accept, well, that's just the way it is, and just keep doing a good job, or just go elsewhere, I guess. Or, I mean, depending on who your like supervisor is, who your boss is, I mean, you could go in and have a talk with the boss, why is this? And they might explain it to you. I don't know. But I mean, the Buddhist explanation of dealing with injustice at work would be pretty much like the first two options that I gave, is either have equanimity, it's just all in accordance with your own karma, or, I mean, if it's just really bad, just find a better place to work. But sort of the middle path might be go in and have a talk with the manager and see what his explanation is. And he might say, well, we're under pressure to have these young diversity hires. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Utheosis, formerly known as Stellar Supreme and more formally known as Libralam, and a whole slew of other names. And Utheosis, formerly known as Stellar Supreme, etc., etc., says this: things have started to click for me about my attitudes toward Buddhist practice, so excuse my heavy-handed question. Do you feel that you betrayed the Buddha's direction of only engaging in solitary practice under the condition that one only do so if they have sufficient concentration and mental stability and they don't cultivate fear, dread, and mental imbalance, considering the practice is aimed at one's dying mental state, on account of the hysteric disorder that you developed and the loss of interest in practice, with the further consideration that the Buddha advised Upali, who was not established in the development of the concentration states of the 9 jhanas and nibbana, that because of his deficiency, he should heed this advice. Quote, Upali, you should live with the Sangha, or community. As you live with the Sangha, you will be at ease, unquote. With the further consideration that if you are not at ease with the Sangha, nor the solitary life, then the requisite path would be, at the very least, going back to the basics of developing concentration as a layperson who carries out the 4 duties, question mark. I'm not trying to go hard on you, hyphen, which I had to turn into a dash. These are just difficult facts that I have been facing off with in my personal life, considering my sweetheart probably won't put up with the dullness of my severe mentality toward the duties of lay Buddhist practice, and that I will likely need to revive my drive toward the monastic life because I have experience with states of concentration and feel a duty to train them in a life that accommodates their higher training in accordance with the development of the fruits of the contemplative life outlined in the Samanyapala Sutta. End of question. But this, I mean, Stellar Supreme, etc., he has this weird way of communicating. I mean, my sweetheart, trying to understand this question, actually asked an AI program to try and interpret it into plain English. I think I kind of understand it, though. But he's got a really abstract, verbose, complicated, convoluted way of communicating that sometimes, frankly, I don't really understand. So anyways, let's see. It's going to take some unpacking, I guess, since there's all these different convoluted strands all kind of interwoven in this question or series of questions or something. Do I feel that I betrayed the Buddha's direction of only engaging in solitary practice? No, because, I mean, probably the best thing that could have happened to me as a monk would be I find an enlightened teacher. I mean, that is like one of the best things you can do. Not just a teacher that you consider to be enlightened, and that happens a lot, but you really find a teacher who is like a master. And I've always had bad luck or bad karma with regard to teachers like that. I mean, in school, I had good teachers, but as a monk, I never really found a monk that I wanted to emulate. I want to be like that. I never found one that when I first went to Burma, I had a very short list of 3 Sayadaws that I thought might really have attainment. One of them was U Pandita. 2 months at Panditarama cured me of that. Another one was Tanjidon Sayadaw. Just 10 days or just a few days at his meditation retreat center cured me of the idea that he really had attained something really like superhuman. Like really advanced wisdom. The other one would be Mahamyane Uzodika, who still is very intelligent, a good meditator, but I mean, in his later years, he was kind of a hypochondriac and just kind of started living in a house in town with his daughter, which, I mean, he wasn't really accepting disciples anyway. That when I first came to Burma, my teacher, my acharya, Venerable Pakoku Sayadaw, wanted to send me to Mahamyane Uzodika because he spoke fluent English, was very intelligent, had kind of a Western point of view. Mahamyane Uzodika did not want to deal with foreign disciples. He had bad experiences with foreign monks already. So, I mean, he wasn't really an option. But, so, I mean, I just did not have a teacher that I really wanted to emulate. Ironically, one of the spiritual teachers I would most be inclined to say, yeah, I want to be like him, would be Neem Karoli Baba. Right there. Up there on the altar. Even though he was obese, he died of like diabetic shock, I think. he was really rotund, partly just because of, sort of the way he worked out we don't need to get into that. But I mean, his only possessions were a loincloth, a blanket, and a water pot, and a diary. I mean, allegedly, those were his only possessions. And in the diary, he wrote the same thing every day. He just wrote Ram, 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 Ram. It was like his meditation mantra. I mean, you see pictures of his diary. It's all just Ram. All of it. So, gosh, I've kind of lost the thread. But yeah, so I mean, if I had found a good teacher or even like a really good community, I would have gone there. But I never really did. So I was pretty much on my own. Like monasteries. I mean, you go to monasteries and you see that, I mean, almost all monasteries in Burma, it's like they're not following Vinaya. They're not even trying to follow Vinaya correctly. Or even in the relatively strict monasteries, there's this rule, you must follow Vinaya, but then the monks are secretly not following Vinaya. Monks are secretly handling money and this kind of thing. So I learned fairly quickly that if I wanted to be a conscientious monk, I should avoid monasteries. And I just never found an enlightened teacher or anywhere near to an enlightened teacher that I could really just want to emulate and just trust what they told me. And there's like the culture barrier between a Westerner and a Burmese monk. Of course, I was ordained in a Burmese tradition, spent most of my monkhood in Burma, and there's like this cultural barrier where the Burmese still have like this medieval attitude towards Buddhism. Everything in the text is true. You can't question any of it. And I just can't do that. I mean, my mind just doesn't work that way. And so I was on my own. No good community to join. I mean, it's like some people advised me to like join an Ajahn Chah monastery, but other monks who knew me fairly well would warn me, there's no way you'd make it an Ajahn Chah monastery. Because even an Ajahn Chah monastery, it's still like conformity based. You have to fit in. You wear the uniform, even if the uniform is not in accordance with Vinaya. You wear the pajamas underneath, or, the kung fu pajamas or whatever it is they wear underneath their robes in the West, even though it's against the rules, technically. I mean, you do that or you're just seen as a troublemaker. It's conformity oriented. Everyone has to like fit in. And I'm just not going to do that. So just being solitary and doing the best I could on my own was the best I could do. And I did fairly well. I mean, with regard to, let's see here, the hysteric disorder that I developed. I mean, even arahants apparently have hysteric disorders. I mean, you just know anything about Sigmund Freud, then, I mean, he wasn't like some sort of infallible oracle, like the Oedipus complex and all that. I really don't have much use for. But still, what he said about hysteria seems pretty valid. That you have these natural urges, and a civilized person represses these natural urges because you can't just be like fondling every pretty woman you come across, that sort of thing. You can't just take whatever you want. You can't just like punch anybody you don't like. You have to repress your urges, restrain yourself, self-restraint, which is basic to Buddhist practice. Then these urges don't just disappear. They just get pushed into your subconscious mind where they build up pressure until they start percolating up to the surface as neurotic symptoms, especially hysterical symptoms, which can be like psychosomatic illnesses, weird behavioral tics, like me clearing my throat a lot could qualify as that, although there's also a certain genetic aspect to me clearing my throat a lot. My mother was the same way. So let's see here. Getting to the Buddha's advice to Upali, and if his advice to the Upali involves the 9 jhanas, then yeah, obviously that's an anachronism. It shouldn't be taken too seriously, because the Buddha didn't teach 9 jhanas. He taught 4. In all likelihood, even the Samanya Pala Sutta doesn't mention anything more than 4 jhanas. And the Samanyapala Sutta is a relatively old sutta. So old that some of the later additions into orthodoxy didn't make it into the Samanyapala Sutta. So, let's see here. Yeah, live with the Sangha. Yeah, good luck finding a good Sangha where everyone is like following the rules correctly and really striving for enlightenment. I was really idealistic when I first became a monk. And before I became a monk, when I was intending to become a monk, I just assumed I'm going to be joining the brotherhood of these wise men striving for enlightenment, and they'll all be wiser than me because they'd been striving longer. And then you get into an actual monastery, and it's not like that at all. I was very, sullen, very disillusioned when I first became a monk, just because I was surrounded by these Asian monks, and some Western monks are like, a lot of Western monks are like this too. I mean, they're not even trying. They just want to live an easy life. I mean, they might have a devout Buddhist belief system, but they're just striving for a better rebirth. They're not even trying for enlightenment. I remember one time the Jehovah's Witness, who used to come and try and convert me about once a week, asked one of the senior monks, one of the Burmese monks, why are you a monk? And it was like, he got this embarrassed look on his face. He was like, because I want to attain Nibbana? It's like a question mark at the end, because that's what he's supposed to say, but it was just what he was supposed to say, so he said it. So let's see here. Did I answer the question? I think maybe I kind of did. Let's see. I'm going to kind of review this long, complicated question. Man, it scrolls way up there. Okay. Do I feel I betrayed the Buddhist direction of only engaging in solitary practice under the condition that one only do so if they have sufficient concentration? Well, I mean, you can do solitary practice as a beginner practically. I mean, once you've gotten enough wasa under your belt, once you're like no longer independent upon a teacher, but even if you're still, it's been less than 5 years that you've been a monk, you can still go off and live alone if you're making progress. And I was making progress for a long time. So, in mental stability, I'm relatively fairly stable mentally. I'm not really a flighty kind of person. I'm not flip-flopping and that kind of thing. So, yeah. I think I pretty much answered that. If I could have found a good community in which I would have fit in, that was led by a really wise monk that I would want to emulate, that I could really take seriously, that's what I should have done, but I just never encountered that situation. And so I'm just going to move on to, what's his name now? Theosis, formerly known as Stellar Supreme, more formally known as Liberlam, etc. Sarah's second question, which is as follows. Do you agree with this advice? If one struggles at advancing in concentration development, they should remain as a monastic working on insight development in the capacity of the 3 marks of existence, because that is conducive to liberation at the last mental state before death. Well, not necessarily. I mean, if you struggle at advancing in concentration development, still you have the option of just mindfulness, general mindfulness, which is one reason why mindfulness is much more popular among Westerners, like compulsively thinking Westerners who can't just get into like deep, like concentrative states that, in a way, having a more moving target of just doing basic mindfulness practice tends to work better for most Westerners, it seems. But I didn't even, let's see. Okay, I'm just going to have to recollect myself here and sort of get back on the track of this question. Should one remain as a monastic working on insight development? I mean, there's more than in the capacity of the 3 marks of existence. I mean, there's so much more to Dhamma than just doing that. I mean, just dealing with your basic defilements, dealing with your urges and your preferences, that kind of thing. I mean, you can use the context or the theme of the 3 marks of existence as a kind of unifying theme to your practice. But I mean, there's so many so many routes or emphases you can make depending on where you're at spiritually. So, see, if one struggles in advancing in concentration development, I mean, sometimes I'm reminded of, there's a sutta, I don't remember what sutta it is, where it's talking about a certain monk who, he's got like strong defilements. You know, he's got lots of lobha, dosa, and moha. And so he's just doing his best with weeping face, just beating his breast, you know, just sort of like the guy in the Bible, dear God, please have mercy upon me, a sinner. He's just sort of like enduring this ordeal of self-restraint. And the result of that is when he dies, he doesn't become enlightened, but at least he goes to heaven. And that's in the suttas. It's kind of a, you know, it's praised by the Buddha. At least it's given as like a potential scenario for some monks that, I mean, you're just not ripe for enlightenment yet. Still, you just kind of force yourself to follow the rules and be a good monk as good as you can. That still there's going to be karmic payoff for that. You're at least going to go to heaven. So, I mean, it's so complicated. There's so many, you don't just follow a cookbook method. I mean, to some degree, you've got to follow like your intuition, or if you've got a good, wise teacher, you could just follow what your teacher advises you instead of making these decisions on your own. So I mean, it can work, just emphasizing the 3 marks of existence. But then again, I mean, it's not the only possible way of doing it. And it's going to depend on just numerous variables. And it's going to be infinitely complex situation that it's not just one size fits all. It's not just one explanation for how things should be done. And I'm just going to move on to Utheosis, formerly known as Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liber Lamb's next question, which is as follows. You noted in your Studies in Archaic Buddhism episode on the Sakapanya Sutta that you regard it to be a composite sutta that to some degree discredits archaic material as corrupted by ancient politics. I understand why you would say this, but I find it hard to believe that there could be teachings that are so potent that they could include things like the perfected mind, like an 8-faceted gem of Digha Nikaya 2, or halting the autonomic nervous system. I understand these are doubtful claims to many people also, wherein Buddha wisdom is even possible to arrive at organically by sheer willpower these days. My question is, if many people have their own signs to the depth of the Buddha's wisdom, like your own experience with malaria in the rain, what reason do we really have to believe that this is a matter of free will and not simply the Buddha being a man fortunate enough to be at a high stage of bhavanga maturation, that such high strangeness is possible, like with human birth being so rare to come by? Who is to say this even has temporal reference on a human scale and isn't just a causal opportunism wherein, say, stream enterers experience their last 7 lives eons apart, and wherein in the past can be traced back for eons, things can't be traced forward, contrary to Abhidhamma, such that the Buddha just knows his dispensation will age in an opportunistic way. The world is pretty wild with paranormal phenomena, like with your ashtray anecdote. So it shouldn't be a big deal for Buddhism to have folkloric features to it. I am reminded of the handful of leaves simile. Sorry, massive question with many threads, lots on my mind. Yeah, it's a massive question that's going all over the place, so that it's hard to say exactly what the question is. Like about halfway down, it was my question is, and then it just continues with the rambling. I mean, possibly as like a matter of like discipline, that people should try to keep their question down to 50 words or less. Because, I mean, when you get into like a 500 word long question or 1,000 word long question, as a general rule, it's more than just one question. So let's see. I mean, I did say that the Sakapanya Sutta is probably corrupt in that it's got like an archaic central portion, and then it's got like a much later beginning and ending, kind of like Jataka stories. So, yeah, I mean, that's mainly what I was saying, that the central portion of the Sakapanya Sutta is like an archaic proto-Padicca Samuppada. Okay. But this part, I understand why you would say this, but I find it hard to believe that there would be teachings that are so potent that they could include things like the perfected mind of, or halting the autonomic nervous system, wherein Buddha wisdom is even possible to arrive at organically by sheer willpower these days. Yeah, it's getting really obscure. My question is, and then he gets to the question, if many people have their own signs to the depths of the Buddha's wisdom, what reason do we really have to believe that this is a matter of free will and not simply the Buddha being a man fortunate enough to be at a high stage of bhavanga maturation? I mean, it's just such an unnecessarily obscure way of asking a question. Seriously. Oh boy. Okay, well, with regard to bhavanga maturation, I mean, that doesn't even really make any sense as far as I can tell. Bhavanga, according to the Abhidhamma philosophy, is just a kind of test pattern in your mind when you're not thinking anything in particular. And it doesn't change over the course of your life. And this free will stuff, I mean, the best I can make of this question is like, to what extent should we consider success in Dhamma to just be like, you're just ripe for enlightenment, rather than like some person just striving and developing like systematically. And yeah, I mean, the Buddha was ripe. I mean, his paramis were fulfilled according to tradition. And that's like one of the main statements I get from Burmese people, about how they've been born into a Burmese culture or a Buddhist culture. They've been Buddhist their entire lives, but still I as a Westerner, could just adopt Buddhism and then start practicing it at a higher level than them. They say that's because of your parami. It's just your past karma. It's not like just anybody can practice Dhamma and become enlightened. There's no guarantee. And most people just are not ripe for Dhamma practice. In fact, most people couldn't even practice Dhamma correctly. They would just crack up trying to practice Dhamma correctly. Even some meditation instructors would crack up if they really were required to practice Dhamma correctly. They just could not do it. So, I mean, it's largely a matter of, are you ripe for enlightenment? And it doesn't have to be like, obviously, like according to the text, Angulimala, who was a serial killer, nevertheless had like a mature enough spiritual root that he could become enlightened in that life. He was converted to Buddhism, converted away from being a serial killer. He became enlightened. So it's the systematic practice that may be required to kind of bring your paramis, your past spiritual momentum to the surface, something like that. But free will, I mean, I don't even necessarily believe that free will exists. If it does exist in this world, it's a paradox, like maybe an inexplicable paradox. Free will logically is impossible. And also, from the Buddhist point of view, especially when you have no self, then how can you have free will with no self? Free will would require some kind of autonomous individual to have the free will, it would seem to me. That the free will itself would have to be some kind of autonomous function, which is ruled out in Buddhism. So, various people just take upon themselves Buddhist training. Some of them are like more mature than others, and they get farther with it. And that's about all I can say, really. Because, I mean, the question is so obscure that it's really hard to tease out what actually is the question. It seems to me that the main point of the question is just, does a person become enlightened just because they're just fortunate and have like the enough karmic capital to just fall into enlightenment, or is it some sort of systematic effort through strength of willpower and so forth? And in the West, I think it's more the latter, because most Westerners who have some sort of awakening experience, they have it accidentally. You know, they have a near-death experience or something that just jolts them out of the samsaric rut that they've been in for who knows how long. But it may be that you need some kind of systematic practice, at least to kind of clear your mind and set yourself up for the availability of that, whatever it is that happens, the crisis that jolts you out of samsara. And I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is a very short question. This is from Ruhe. How much value do you place on etymology? And I mean, it's kind of an interesting question. How much value do you place on etymology? I mean, I like etymologies. I'm interested in etymologies. Sometimes I'll look up etymologies of words, and sometimes it can help you to understand the meaning of the word, but not always. Like the English word understanding. I mean, literally, it means you're standing under something. But I mean, how does that help you to understand what the word understanding means? So, it's really interesting. Like just following, like Indo-European roots, that kind of thing. That's interesting to me. Like most people wouldn't realize that the word goose in English has the same Indo-European etymology as the word hamsa in Pali, or in Sanskrit, which usually is translated as swan or wild goose. But I'm pretty sure the hamsa bird is the ruddy shell duck, which is like a goose. So how does hamsa and goose, how are they derived from the same word? Well, goose, the English word goose comes from like the Germanic word gans, like still is found in like the word gander, which is a male goose. And from gans to hamsa, as it's a lot closer, it's more obvious that way. So sometimes the etymologies of words can help you to understand the meaning, or at least the original meaning of the word, but I mean, it's not really necessary. And indulging in fake etymologies, like the commentaries do a lot. You know, like the word bhikkhu. You know, it means usually translated as monk or sometimes as like mendicant, bhikkhu. And it's like the commentarial tradition has this weird folk etymology that it's like baya ekadi, which means one who sees the danger in samsara, when really the real etymology of the word bhikkhu, the more likely etymology anyway, is it means beggar. Bekam, bekadi, bhikkhu. Bekadi is like the verb form of bhikkhu, and it means to ask for, to beg for. Bekam is another noun form of that same verb, which means alms food. Food given to a beggar. So how much value do I place on it? I mean, it's not really necessary to know etymologies, except for maybe in a few cases. You want to know what a word means, like the word asawa can help you to understand what asawas mean. You know, it means like influx, influence, something that flows in, that becomes like an encumbrance. It's like sticks to you, that kind of thing. I mean, it can help you to understand certain things, but I mean, not necessarily. So, I mean, it has some value, but it's not like invaluable. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. And Ethiopian Fake Tig says, after I look at the clock and see, we've been going for over 2 hours already. Yeah, this is going to be a long one. Yeah. Ethiopian Fake Tig says, Daniel Ingram has a book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, and in it he explains the stages of insight in a very Western-friendly way. The connotation of the entire thing is that one can start the insight practice and finish it. He himself claims to be an arahant, and he has done some form of study to prove that his brainwaves are unique to that of a regular person. What are your thoughts on people like him, and do you think just about anyone can complete the stages of insight with just a few years of practice, because that is how everyone is treating it and claiming that they have achieved equanimity? Well, like in my answer to Eutheosis, is most people just are not ripe for enlightenment. That even if they try to practice correctly, they won't be able to. It'll just drive them into some sort of mental breakdown or meltdown or something. So what are my thoughts on Daniel Ingram? My best guess with regard to Daniel Ingram is that he is a sociopath. Anyone. Like on his website, I looked at his website years ago when I was a monk. The homepage of his website, the first thing you see is him bragging and listing off all these attainments. It was with just like becoming fully enlightened was like one of the minor ones. And so I think he's probably a huckster. He's a clever one, and he's got some kind of insight, like a lot of cult leaders have. You don't become a cult leader just by just being a truck driver and deciding, well, I'm tired of driving trucks, I'm just going to become a cult leader. You have to have charisma and a glib way of explaining difficult subjects, especially spiritual ones, that just sound like you're this fount of wisdom, when that's not necessarily the case. Osho was another one, the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He'd be kind of the same way. I'm not even sure if the Bhagwan himself would go as far as Daniel Ingram and just brag about how enlightened he is. The so-called Jed McKenna is another one of these, who just brags and brags and brags about how enlightened he is. And anyone like that, that's red flags. It's like something that, according to the text, a really enlightened person shouldn't do, even though, it was mentioned earlier on, the Buddha himself in the text is continually doing this stuff. But I'm skeptical as to whether the Buddha himself really did that kind of stuff. But I saw a video with Daniel Ingram, and he seems just like this nervous, fidgety kind of guy, not like you'd expect from a fully enlightened being. But that's just my best guess. So let's see. Do I think that just about anyone can complete the stages of insight with just a few years of practice? No, I do not. Yeah, okay, so I guess I answered that question. I'm very skeptical. I'm not just going to flat out assert that Daniel Ingram is a fraud and a sociopath, but that would kind of be a plausible guess based on what I know of him. Which isn't very much, I have to admit. There have been some of these enlightened beings, Andrew Cohen, I think was his name, who, he was sort of a Daniel Ingram type. He was declaring himself to be fully enlightened until after years of this, he kind of got into some kind of unsavory thing going with a female supporter or something, and then some of his supporters were saying, no way, you're not really enlightened if you're doing that. And then he actually said, yeah, I guess you're right. I guess I was mistaken. Because you can be mistaken. Even an honest person can believe that they're enlightened or have some attainment, and really they're just overestimating their own attainment. So that's possible too. So it may be that Daniel Ingram isn't a deliberate fraud, but at the same time, he's not fully enlightened either. He just kind of thinks he is. That's a possibility too. But all the bragging about how enlightened he is that just seems like a red flag to me. And I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's next question, which is as follows. While reading Jungian books, I have come across the idea that a coming-of-age ritual for boys needs to be done for them to mature into men. I have also realized that what keeps men infantilized is this idea that something bad might happen here or there. Uninitiated men have high levels of stress hormones like women do, and don't take the risk and do what's needed to be on their own. What are your thoughts on this and a coming of age ritual for men these days? Well, my coming of age ritual was on my 16th birthday when I got drunk as a skunk and higher than the proverbial Georgia pine, both for the first time in my life. And it just opened up like this whole new world for me. But yeah, I've got a book on the bookcase, Battle for the Mind by William Sargent, that is one of the most important books I ever read. I recommend it to anybody, even though it was written back around like 1950 or something. And he talks about how higher vertebrates, including humans and Pavlov's dogs, are governed by habit. We're just kind of locked into habitual habit patterns, which are, from a Buddhist point of view, karmic. And it takes some kind of crisis to knock us out of this habitual habit pattern. It's like, even if these habit patterns are like dysfunctional and cause us to be unhappy, you know, we can go through life just a miserable mess. So long as it's keeping us, you know, like above water, you know, it's like, so long as it's keeping us alive and functioning, it's good enough. And just instinctively, we cling to it. We don't want to let it go until we get into this crisis situation when our habitual way of dealing with reality just isn't working anymore. And then we have like this breakdown, and then we become very open to suggestion. And that is capitalized on by various people. Like Chinese brainwashing was like this, where you just break the person down in this indoctrination camp, you know, through just working them half to death, not giving them enough food, not allowing them enough sleep until they have like a breakdown. And then like the commissar, the Communist Party representative comes in and starts indoctrinating you, and you just soak it up like a sponge and become a good communist afterwards. You know, like 1984, you know, the Ministry of Truth or whatever it was. No, not the Ministry of Truth, but, you know, the place where they get sent to get indoctrinated, you know, room 9 or whatever it was, is like that. Like, indoctrination methods of like the Stalinist Soviet Union was like that, where they get you not only to confess to trying to overthrow the government, but actually get you to believe that you were trying to overthrow the government through the same kind of stuff, just lack of sleep, just horrible conditions. You're being eaten alive by bed bugs. You know, you're wearing clothes that are way too big, so you got to hold your pants up all the time. And then you're just like being sent into this, you don't have enough sleep, you're sleep deprived, you get sent into this room where they're just like, just hounding you, asking the same questions over and over again. Why did you do it? Why did you do it? This kind of thing, until you just have this breakdown and actually start believing that you did it. And it turns out like military basic training, you know, like Full Metal Jacket kind of stuff. I mean, that does the same thing. It breaks down this soft, wimpy city guy, and he has this kind of crisis, and then the drill instructor just reforms him into just this fighting machine that will not hesitate to obey an order. Some religious methods, like Methodism, started off this way, where you trigger this breakdown by just pounding away at the fact that if you don't repent, you're going to burn in hell forever and ever. And people just could not argue against it. You know, it was just the 1700s in rural England. I mean, that was just the truth. I mean, you couldn't really argue against it. And so, like John Wesley, they would just pound away at this. If you don't repent of your sins, you're going to burn in hell forever and ever. And then they'd give these fire and brimstone sermons about what it's like to be tortured in hell. And people would just start freaking out. You know, they'd be foaming at the mouth, like in convulsions on the floor. But when they'd finally come to their senses, they were born again. And that's when you had like the Methodist, you know, the indoctrinators, you know, like helping them to become good Christians, this sort of thing. And like in tribal societies, the manhood rituals are the same, where these kids, they'd get the bejesus scared out of them, you know, doing these manhood rituals or just being sent off into a forest alone to survive, this kind of stuff. They'd have the crisis, and then they'd get reformed into these men worthy of being, you know, warriors of the tribe who will just sacrifice their life for the benefit of the tribe without hesitation. That kind of thing has happened in humanity in various contexts since the Stone Age. And now it is true that people just do not have these initiation ceremonies anymore. These rituals where you go through like a crisis stage, where then you become malleable and can be like indoctrinated. So let's see, what's the actual question here? What are your thoughts on this in a coming of age ritual? Yeah, I mean, to some degree in the West, coming of age rituals, I mean, joining the military where you go through basic training and you're still in kind of a tough level of the military. I like in the Army now, or the Navy. I've read articles about how it's just got totally wimpy, and you're not really doing anything remotely resembling, the recruits in Full Metal Jacket, where you've got the guy threatening to gouge out your eyeballs and skull fuck you, and this kind of thing. So, let's see. What are my thoughts on this and a coming of age ritual for men these days? Yeah, the coming of age ritual, I mean, I'm unaware of really going through anything like that until, well, no, I've had my crises. Like when I was like 16, 17 years old, I had like a spiritual crisis that resulted in significant spiritual growth. So, in my case, the coming of age ceremony was just kind of spontaneous and just thrust upon me by circumstance. Well, I mean, if you could even call it a coming of age ceremony, not the 16th birthday, but just like the spiritual crisis that resulted in my father sending me to a youth counselor who happened to be a spiritual guy, giving me Ram Dass books to read, etc., etc. I don't know if it's so much the initiation. I mean, this kind of initiation, it can have good results or bad results. Turning into a good communist is not necessarily a good result. So it can be used for good or for bad. I think it's more just like a feminized culture. It's not so much the lack of these indoctrinate or these like coming of age ceremonies. That it's not necessarily the lack of that's turning men into social eunuchs, culturally castrated social eunuchs. It's just growing up in a feminized society where being masculine is considered to be toxic. It's a problem. And men are just sort of like discriminated against for being men. A real alpha male, I guess, would just like say, fuck that, I'm being who I am. But a lot of the, sort of young guys who, I don't know, maybe they just didn't have much of an opportunity for that. They have sort of a beta father, feminized mother, feminist mother, that kind of thing. It's just sort of like a handicap. But, I mean, being really like just a total animal of a man where you're like punching holes in walls for no good reason, that kind of thing, that's not good either. But like athletics was another kind of way of, just being a wrestler or a football player in junior high or high school. That could help you to sort of instill you some masculine virtues. So I really don't think that this kind of reforming initiation, putting you into a state of crisis, is necessary. But having like a culture that promotes masculinity, that doesn't demonize masculinity. Ancient Sparta, I don't know if the ancient Spartans had their manhood rituals other than just the toughness of raising boys, to be fighters, that kind of thing. So I think it's more just a culture, a feminized culture is more pernicious than the modern loss of like manhood rituals, that kind of thing, where you got to have these cuts made without flinching. You got to keep like a complete poker face while they're making the cuts in your chest and like putting ashes in so that it'll become like these welt-like scars that are like decorations, badges of honor kind of a thing. It's not really necessary to be a man, but having some kind of culture that promotes masculine virtues is much more important in my opinion. And I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian fake Tig's next question. He says, there is an ancient Hawaiian practice called Ho'oponopono. It's a kind of, did I say that right? Ho'oponopono. Yeah, it's Ho'oponopono. It's a kind of transcendental meditation type of practice where you repeat the mantra, he's got manta, the mantra, I love you, thank you. Have you ever heard of it? And thoughts on transcendental meditation? I don't know much about transcendental meditation. You know, it was brought to the West by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and it was in fashion among celebrities. Like the Beatles went to the Maharishi's ashram, and it inspired the song Sexy Sadie, possibly Come Together. But I mean, the Hawaiian practice of Ho'oponopono, never heard of it before, where you repeat the mantra, I love you, thank you. It reminds me of, there's a Ram Dass book where he wrote about, or it's a transcript of his talks, I think, but he was talking about some Tibetan Lama came up with a mantra to help Tibetan people understand the Western mind. And it was this mantra of like, please, please, sorry, thank you. Please, please, sorry, thank you. You just keep doing this, and it helps you to get insight into what it's like to be a Westerner. That's what it reminds me of. Because it obviously doesn't remind me of any transcendental meditation practiced by ancient Hawaiians who were cannibals. I mean, it didn't make them all that saintly, apparently, because they were still practicing ritual cannibalism, although I guess Catholics practice ritual cannibalism too. And their secret ceremonies. So, yeah, I mean, meditating on the mantra, I love you, thank you. I mean, it might work for some people. It might help. It might make you be a more like benevolent or empathetic sort of person. Possibly. I mean, you could try it and see what it does, see what the effects are. But I really don't know that much about transcendental meditation. It was a big deal back in the late 60s, though. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And Siddhartha Lohachita says, do you know if there is any equivalent in an old European language to the word Dharma? Well, if you wanted to find an equivalent in an old European language to the word Dharma, your best bet would probably be Lithuanian. Look up like some equivalent to the word Dharma in Lithuanian. You know, maybe it would have the same etymology as Dharma. That might be your best bet, because Lithuanian is a very conservative Indo-European language, and it comes very close in many respects to Indic languages like Pali and Sanskrit. It's remarkable how close to Pali and Sanskrit Lithuanian can be at times. But the word Dharma is just a weird word. Like in Pali, it's Dhamma. And it is like a noun form of the verb dare di, which means to bear, to hold up. And before the Buddhist time, it came to mean law. Like law is what holds up society, I guess. And then it came to mean like philosophy. Also, it has the meaning of anything ultimately real, not just some ephemeral phenomenon that is just relatively real, but anything. I mean, it could just mean anything. Like in the first verse of the Dhammapada, it apparently means just things. But in the commentarial tradition, it's interpreted to mean mental states, like in the first verse of the Dhammapada, which then the commentator, Buddhaghosa, has to explain why the Dhammapada would say that consciousness precedes mental states when really they're simultaneous. But we don't have to go there, although we already did. So, I mean, there is no equivalent in English to the word Dhamma or Dharma, because Dhamma or Dharma has so many meanings. You know, it can mean philosophy, it can mean law, it can mean something that's ultimately real, it can mean mental states, it probably can mean a bunch of other things I'm just not thinking of right now. But if there is any equivalent in an old European language, or the closest you're going to get to an equivalent for a word that has so many different meanings, just they are like conditioned by ancient, like Indo-Aryan culture, then I would go with try Lithuanian. If you don't find it in Lithuanian, there's a good chance there just isn't one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Cherzaskaz's. And I do hope this Q&A doesn't turn into 4 hours. Just saying. Cherzaskaz's says, do you think it is possible to predict lottery numbers? I don't see why not. Anything imaginable is possible. So yeah, it's possible. Sure, why wouldn't it be possible to predict lottery numbers? It would be kind of liminal. I mean, if anyone consistently predicted lottery numbers, then in a way you'd be sort of creating like a tension spot in the matrix, which could then cause the matrix to crash or something if it got too extreme. But yeah, it's definitely possible. I don't see why it wouldn't be possible. And I'm just going to move on to Cherzask, because this is the next question. What is it with all these fortune teller monks in Theravada? Well, it's sort of like I was saying earlier, that most Asian monks really are not striving for enlightenment. And so in Burma, there are a lot of fortune teller monks. Also, there are a lot of alchemist monks. Also, there are a lot of just, astronaut monks who are just taking up space. I mean, there's like in the Zen, they'd be called clothes hangers and rice bags, because all they're good for is just to hang clothes on and to put rice into. So yeah, I remember reading back when I was a monk about the Thai forest tradition in Ajahn Mun, how like over 100 years ago in Thailand, there was almost no forest tradition at all. There were almost no monks who were really striving for enlightenment. Like in Sri Lanka, even nowadays, there are a lot of monks who think there's just no more enlightenment in this world. There's no point in even trying. Just be a scholar. Just memorize the texts. And just preserve the texts by memorizing them and learning, the exegesis and all. And that's the best you can do. So in like Ajahn Mun's time, that people just were not used to monks that actually practiced. Monks were like secular clergy, and a lot were fortune tellers. A lot were like herbal healers. There's some herbal healer monks in Burma too. Tanji Donshiado had his own line of herbal medicines, but if you'd read what he would say about health, you'd realize that, I mean, he didn't know. I remember reading some of the stuff of Tanji Donshiado that he's saying, like, for the teeth, white things are best, but the best white thing for the teeth is salt. For general health, bitter things are best, but the best bitter things for general health are neem fruits and neem leaves. This was like his health advice to people, like bitter things in general. I mean, most natural occurring poisons are bitter, but we don't need to go there, even though we already did. So fortune teller monks in Theravada, yeah, fortune teller monks and teachers, teaching grade schools, that kind of thing. That was a big thing. Like in Burmese, the word jaun means monastery and school, because traditionally kids would get like up to like a 4th grade education just going to the monastery, and the monks would be teaching them how to read and write and do arithmetic. So there's that. There's herbal healers. There's alchemists there's supposedly a number of monks in Burma who can transmute base metals into gold, even though you don't see large piles of gold around in Burma. So it's largely just a traditional thing. It's a kind of an esoteric thing that it's kind of mysterious and exalted that monks can kind of practice, and ignorant villagers don't know any better and just assume that's what they're supposed to be doing. That kind of thing. Palm readers, astrologers, that kind of thing. It's pretty common. And one of the main reasons is that Dhamma has become corrupt, and most monks just aren't monks because they want to strive for enlightenment in this very life. They just, for whatever reasons, various reasons why, like some Burmese villager will become a monk. And desire for enlightenment probably isn't in the top 10 of the most common reasons. Not in the top 3, definitely. So it's just the way it is. And I'm going to move on to Trzaska's third question. What about a new video with Otto Excelsior? Yeah, that's possible. New videos with Brian probably going to happen. Possibly even new videos with Ajahn Punadamo. So, yeah, it's possible. It's just that I'm lazy. I work for a living. I work hard, even though I'm lazy. So on weekends when I don't have to work, I tend to be lazy. But if he comes up with a good idea for us to talk about, strangely, one of the most popular videos I have on YouTube is Otto and me talking about esoteric Hitlerism, of all things, from a more or less Buddhist perspective. So yeah, it's probably going to happen. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. And we're getting close to the bottom here. I don't think this probably won't even be 3 hours, so we're doing all right. Let's see here. Next question is from Zenithoid. And Zenithoid says, what do you make of Carl Jung's quote, "For a tree to reach up to heaven, its roots must reach down to hell"? In the context of Buddhism, I think this may be true, in that one will have to have their dark night of the soul, but to achieve full enlightenment, anything unpure must be erased completely. In many suttas, the Buddha says tatna must be cut off at the roots. Well, one thing this quote from Jung, "For a tree to reach up to heaven, its roots must reach down to hell," reminds me of William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which was like my Bible as a high school student. That and The Madman by Khalil Gibran. Those were like my two Bibles. The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by William Blake and The Madman by Khalil Gibran. Those were like my two Bibles when I was like 17 years old. And The Marriage of Heaven and Hell points out that you can't just have good without bad. It's a dichotomy. Good and bad have to balance out. Heaven and hell. You can't have one without the other. But with regard to Buddhism, it's that way in Buddhism too. They don't really emphasize it, but it's like good and evil have to both be abolished by a bhikkhu who's striving for enlightenment. You don't want bad karma. You don't want good karma either. Karma is for lay people. So the monk has to abandon good and evil, the whole duality of good and bad. The wise monk just dismisses them. So let's see. To achieve full enlightenment, anything impure must be erased completely. Anything pure must be erased completely. You just don't even go there. You're not wallowing in this samsaric dualism of good and evil. So Taoism really puts more of an emphasis on this. But in Buddhism also, it's like the wise monk. He's not trying to do good any more than he's trying to do evil. You just transcend the duality of it. But if you're going to have heaven, you're going to have hell. You're going to have plus, you're going to have minus. You're going to have good, you're going to have bad. If you have beautiful, you're going to have ugly. So long as you're dealing in that samsaric, dualistic way of perceiving things. Like I've said before, in accordance with my principle of subjective equilibrium, that if a person somehow managed to eliminate all of what he considers to be bad in his life, one of two things is going to happen. Either a whole bunch of new bad stuff is going to have to take the place of the old bad stuff, or the line differentiating good and bad is going to shift so that the lower half of what he used to call good now becomes bad. So I do think Carl Jung's quote is correct in like a samsaric dualistic context. For a tree to reach up to heaven, its roots must reach down to hell. Yeah, I can live with that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Dario, and he's the last questioner of this Q&A. And I almost always get taken by surprise because for some reason the little bar on the side that shows how far down you are, it somehow messes up and it just doesn't work right. So that it's like I'm halfway down. The little bar thing is like halfway down the document, and all of a sudden, boom, I'm at the last question, even though there's not a lot of empty space below the last question. Anyways, Dario says, what is your position on Zen Buddhism? Not the westernized and liberal form, or this form. See, look at his little head's bobbling. But, okay, let's just start the question over again. The bobble-headed monk distracted me ever so briefly. What is your position on Zen Buddhism? Not the westernized and liberal form, but the actual teachings of Bodhidharma and the sects that pay more respect to the original teachings of the Buddha. And more importantly, do you think that Zen Buddhism can be a path to enlightenment and nirvana? Well, I guess that's two questions, isn't it? Let's just separate them. And I'll deal with the first question first. What is my position on Zen Buddhism? Well, I have said before I was converted to Theravada, my intention was to become a Soto Zen monk. My original plan after I decided to become a monk was to become a Zen monk. And part of the reason for that is that I thought Zen Buddhism was like Zen Buddhism in the books, where you've got these mysterious men wearing black, standing around, speaking in riddles and hitting each other with sticks. And I mean, I could relate to that. I mean, that just seemed like attractive to me as an option, like a career option, to be a man dressed in black, very enigmatic, just talking in riddles and beating people with sticks. I mean, it really seemed like, you know, a worthwhile way of spending one's life. And then I went to an actual Zen monastery and I found out it wasn't like that at all. Nobody would dare to hit anybody with a stick at that monastery. And it was lots of Pure Land Buddhism was mixed in. And I was told that in Zen Buddhism, that for some reason, traditional Zen Buddhism has just absorbed lots of Pure Land Buddhism, which I've never had any use at all for Pure Land Buddhism. Zen Buddhism, like in the books, like in the koans, the Blue Cliff Record or the Mumonkan, that kind of thing, I really like that. I was really drawn to that. I really like the sort of the disorientation of koans. You know, it's sort of like trying to break through the intellectual process, and which is, you know, samsara essentially. So yeah, I do think that Zen Buddhism does have validity. Just remove the Pure Land elements, which I got no use for, and just some of the, like, even if you dismiss the Pure Land elements, there's still a lot of weird, like, later Mahayana philosophy and cosmology and mythology, like Vairochana. You know, there's a lot of mention of Vairochana in like Zen texts. There's no mention at all in Theravada. You know, it's just like a later thing, like these bodhisattvas and all this. You know, the Mahayana elements in Zen also, I really don't have much use for. But Zen as just iconoclastic and don't rely on dogmas. You know, you meet the Buddha in the road, kill him, that kind of stuff. And just the koans. You know, like there's one koan I really like, Jojoza. He's an obscure, he's pretty much known only from this one koan. There was this monk named Jojoza, at least that's the Japanese version of his Chinese name. And he asked, possibly Rinzai, he asked some Zen master, you know, what is the essence of the teachings of Buddha? And the Zen master just like comes up to him, grabs him, and just like shoves him. And Jojoza stood still. You know, he's just kind of confused. He doesn't know what to do. And so another monk who witnessed this says, Jojoza, why don't you bow? So Jojoza gets down and starts bowing. And while he's bowing, he becomes enlightened. And that kind of thing, I mean, it's interesting to me because there's obviously some meaning to it, even though it's like this paradoxical, not rational or logical really, but it kind of makes sense to me. You know, a lot of koans are like that. I mean, it makes sense without making sense, sort of, which is a Zen-like thing to say, I guess. So Zen Buddhism, I've liked Zen Buddhism. I don't like the Pure Land elements. I'm not particularly fond of the Mahayana elements, the emphasis on bodhisattvas over like arahants, that kind of thing. That just becoming fully enlightened just somehow isn't good enough. That's clearly not what Gautama Buddha was teaching. But, and also eating bamboo shoots. I really do not like bamboo shoots. And they eat lots of bamboo shoots at Zen monasteries, or so I have read. So I wouldn't like that very much. But yeah, it's just sort of the austerity and the simplicity of Zen, with or without the koans. I mean, Soto Zen doesn't do much koan stuff. You know, it's just more like shikantaza, or just sort of a kind of meditation that I was doing. I used to call it second gear, where you're just watching the mind intently, just observing, you know, just trying to catch anything as it arises, trying to catch any thought just as it begins to arise, that kind of thing. But the Zen monastery I went to in California, it just kind of cured me of any desire to become a Zen monk. And then I went to a Theravada place after that, and it just seemed pretty obvious to me that the Theravada monastery came closer to what the Buddha originally taught than the Zen place I went to. There's just way too many like ceremonies and chanting and bowing and all this that I've really never been into ceremonies. In Theravada Buddhism, there are ceremonies, but there's always a reason for the ceremony instead of just like gratuitous bowing to doorways and that kind of thing. So, yeah, Zen Buddhism would be my second choice after Theravada, I guess, of the extant schools of Buddhism in existence. And it was originally my intention to become a Soto Zen monk until I got more experience with like Zen as it actually is, not in the books, but as it actually is, and or at least as it actually is in America, and Theravada Buddhism. So Theravada Buddhism seems pretty obvious to come closer to what the Buddha originally taught, especially if you're reading books like the Sutta Nipata. So, let's see, did I answer the question yet? What is your position on Zen Buddhism? Yeah, I guess I gave my position on Zen Buddhism. So, secondly, Dario says, or Dario, and more importantly, do you think that Zen Buddhism can be a path to enlightenment and nirvana? Yeah, I think that they're probably assuming that anybody becomes enlightened in this world, in this samsaric environment, just assuming for the sake of argument that anybody has become fully enlightened. I see no reason why a lot of the Zen masters that you read about, I see no reason why they would not be fully enlightened. And sometimes you come across a statement like in the platform Sutra of Huineng, which I guess is now considered to be like a forgery, not really taught by Huineng. But in this platform Sutra of Huineng, there is this statement that really made an impression on me. That is, I mean, when you become enlightened, you look around and you notice that everybody else is also enlightened. You know, it's like you look through the world with enlightened eyes, you see enlightenment. You see Nibbana. Which kind of reminds me of St. Paul of Tarsus in the New Testament saying, to the pure man, all things are pure. So there's some insight. It seems like a statement like that may have been based on actual experience of some Zen master, even if it wasn't Huineng himself. So, yeah, I mean, Zen Buddhism can be a path to enlightenment and nirvana. I think Hinduism, some types of Hinduism can be a path to enlightenment and nirvana. I think St. John of the Cross, who was a Catholic, a Roman Catholic Christian, I think he may have been enlightened. It's possible. I mean, sometimes people are just ripe, and so they can somehow manage to become enlightened in spite of their culture, or in spite, or largely in spite of their religion. Some of the doctrines of Roman Catholicism are not really like conducive to enlightenment, like the idea that no one is worthy, it's only the grace of God that's going to get you into heaven, that kind of thing. I mean, that just sort of implies that nobody's going to be perfected. Jesus himself denies being good in the New Testament. Somebody calls him like good teacher or something, and Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? There's none good except God." Which seems to imply, not only that Jesus was denying being good or God, but he was denying that anyone is perfect, including himself. But then along comes St. John of the Cross, who is the mystical doctor of the Catholic Church. Anything he says on the topic of mysticism is considered to be official dogma of the Catholic Church. He's saying that that there is the stage of perfection, that an adept at high contemplation can reach this stage of perfection where their self-will is mortified. They no longer have any self-will. They no longer have any chetana, using Pali terminology, and so they become just this instrument of God, an instrument of divinity. They're like God's puppet. And St. John of the Cross was apparently teaching this based on his own insight, his own experience. And it comes very close to like the Buddhist arahant, who is generating no will, because he's not generating any karma, and karma is will. Although from the Buddhist point of view, you don't say that you're just like a puppet of God, that you're no longer acting on your own will, that you're acting on divine will. They don't really have that to fall back on as a kind of theory to explain the reality in Buddhism. So, in Theravada, or the commentarial tradition, or Abhidhamma, they have to come up with Kriya Chitta, which is some way of explaining how an enlightened monk, an enlightened being, still functions without generating any volition, without having any will. So anyways, getting back to Dario's question here, do you think that Zen Buddhism can be a path to enlightenment and nirvana? Yeah, I do. Especially if you're following like the old-fashioned kind of Zen, like Joshu, that kind of thing. But then again, being a discalced Carmelite like St. John of the Cross could be a path to enlightenment and nirvana. Being a Vedantist Hindu, a Shaivite Hindu like Ramana Maharshi, a Vaishnavite Hindu like Neem Karoli Baba. Yeah, or for some people, it's like you don't even have to be religious. You just have like this store of like karmic momentum, or just wisdom from past lives, presumably. And then you have like a near-death experience or some such, and it just jolts you into a state of higher consciousness. So, yeah, I do think that Zen can be a path to enlightenment and nirvana. I could have just answered that whole question with just yes, but then you miss out on all the extraneous verbiage. And we're done. That's it. I'm done. Which is good, because the beverage is pretty much empty. So, like I should always say at the beginning, and practically never do, if you have any questions you think I can answer, especially with regard to like Dharma, early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, just Dharma in general, philosophy, that kind of thing, feel free to ask. I can't absolutely guarantee that I'll be able to answer the question, and especially I can't guarantee that I'll answer it to your satisfaction, but I'll give it a shot anyway. And like and subscribe if you like or have liked at least parts of what I have said. And, let's see, what else? Be sure to check out the URL links below the video. And that's it. Yeah, be happy and stuff. And I'm going to turn it off now. That's what I'm going to do.